Story 1.
This year, the summer was truly hot. People walking down the street hurried to find shelter from the scorching rays of the sun. The asphalt heated up so much that it began to melt. Suddenly, a car drove by, spraying water. A dog ran behind it, wagging its tail, rejoicing in the small relief from the heat. Although it was blistering outside, in the office belonging to a bottled water company, it was hot for a different reason. It was the peak of the season. Sales had skyrocketed, and employees were bustling around fulfilling orders. The air conditioners were running at full blast, but it didn't help much. The panting and sweating manager from the 5th floor entered the planning department to deliver some papers. To her surprise, there was a calm atmosphere here. But suddenly, one of the 3 girls working here jumped up indignantly and said, "Who stole my candy again? Can't you just stop?" She looked around angrily, but everyone remained silent, apparently used to such scenes. The girl's name was Sophia. She threw a menacing glance first at the 2 guys, then at her neighbor. But the strangest thing was that she didn't suspect the slender girl with dark curly hair sitting in the corner. It seemed like nobody noticed her. The girl's name was Anna. She had been working at this company for 5 years already, but hadn't managed to make friends with anyone during that time. The manager who had just come in handed her the papers, silently placing them on the table, and left. Anna was used to such treatment. Since childhood, everyone ignored her. Even in the orphanage where she grew up, the bullies avoided her. She always wanted social interaction, but it seemed like an insurmountable barrier. Approaching someone and starting a conversation was something fantastic for her. She thought that after school, her life would change. But it didn't happen. Neither in the cheap college nor at the new job, where she was also unnoticed. It had become the norm for her. Her reaction to the noisy colleague was only irritation. In fact, she had long wanted to change jobs, but her love for one person stopped her. His name was Edward. He worked in their finance department as an analyst. Sitting in her corner, she sneakily glanced at him. Seeing his blonde, well-groomed hair, neat nose, and beautiful smile, she sighed quietly. Yes, he was handsome. But Anna loved him not only for that. He was very kind. One of the few who noticed her and tried to communicate with her. Every time she tried to talk to him, her throat seemed to tighten, and she just walked past. Next to Edward sat James. That was someone Anna didn't like. He was silent and arrogant. Every time their eyes met, he turned his head away as if seeing her made him sick. He was a brunette, tall and quite handsome. Many girls in the company secretly sighed over him, but she wasn't one of them. You could even say he annoyed her. But most of all, she hated Sophia. She was a beautiful girl sitting opposite her desk. Next to her was her chubby friend Sarah. These 2 were always together like those high school girlfriends from teen movies. Sarah was quite sweet and open, unlike Sophia, who was somewhat arrogant, but only until she talked to Edward. Then she immediately changed, turning into a fragile and vulnerable victim. She really liked him, so she often hovered around him, trying to attract his attention. This greatly annoyed Anna. And this time Sophia began complaining to him about the theft of her sweets. They were special expensive candies that she liked to buy at a luxury store. She ate 1 or 2 pieces a day. Someone constantly took a couple of them from her cupboard. Then it was time to listen to her whining and complaints. Edward tried to comfort her, promising that they would go to that store together and he would buy her more. She still got what she wanted, Anna thought spitefully to herself. But then she took the papers that were brought to her and immersed herself in her work. Time flew by quickly, and the end of the day came, but everyone in the department decided to stay late at work. Tomorrow was a day off, and they needed to wrap up all the pending tasks. When it was 8 o'clock on the clock, Sophia was the first to get up and, stretching, suggested to everyone to go for dinner at a nice restaurant. Sarah agreed first, then they looked at Edward with pleading eyes, and he had to agree too. Then the three of them surrounded James, who apparently didn't want to go, but he sighed, got up, and followed them. But before they left, Edward stopped and said, "What about Anna? Shouldn't we invite her?" Sophia made a puzzled grimace, as if not understanding whom he was talking about, but then, as if remembering her, she turned to her. "Anna, don't you want to go with us?" But she shook her head in refusal. Then Edward started persuading her, and she couldn't resist anymore. The five of them left the building and headed down the street to the place. The daytime heat had subsided a bit, and it was much more pleasant to walk along the street. The empty streets filled with people made Anna feel uncomfortable. She walked behind the whole group, trying not to lag behind. The guys chatted cheerfully, discussing various topics and rejoicing at the end of this tough week. Finally, they arrived at the right place. It was a small Mexican restaurant which lured with its cozy atmosphere. Bright colors dominated the interior. Orange and red walls were decorated with colorful ornaments and traditional Mexican wall paintings. In the corner, the gentle sound of a guitar played, adding a special flavor to the evening. Small wooden tables were covered with tablecloths in the national style, and on each of them stood small vases with green cacti. The waiter in bright national clothes smiled at them and pointed to a free table by the window, from where there was a view of a cozy courtyard with lush plants and twinkling lights. Taking their seats, the five colleagues started to choose dishes. Anna sat in the corner, trying not to disturb anyone. She looked at the menu, not knowing what to order. In fact, she didn't like spicy food, but she was embarrassed to say so. Then Edward asked her, smiling widely, what she wanted, and she nervously pointed to the first dish she saw. "Oh, you like spicy," he said, placing the order. When the food arrived, Anna tried a piece and realized that it was really very spicy, but Edward kept looking at her, and she swallowed another piece. When her face turned red from the heat, she waved her hand to her face, trying to cool down. Then he noticed it and handed her water. How sweet he is, after all, Anna thought to herself. Sophia noticed this small scene and decided to divert attention to herself by starting to tell some funny story that happened to her. Occasionally, she threw spiteful glances at Anna, which made her uncomfortable. With time, the first dishes were eaten, washed down with alcohol, and they ordered more food. A relaxing atmosphere settled at the table. Sophia was already quite drunk and began making unmistakable signs to Edward, whispering something in his ear or touching him with her hands. But he seemed not to mind. Everyone laughed and had fun, except Anna. Watching them, she gritted her teeth and clenched her fists with anger. Sophia's advances toward Edward infuriated her. She could barely contain herself. And the worst thing for her was that he accepted all these intimate hints without trying to distance himself from her. The last straw for her was when Sophia accidentally kissed him. Anna jumped up from her seat, startling her colleagues, and said she needed to go to the restroom, then left. Standing in front of the mirror, she tried to compose herself, but scenes with these two kept popping up in her head. She was filled with rage, something gnawed at her, and an unpleasant lump constricted her chest. She decided to leave to stop torturing herself. Walking out into the hall, she headed towards the table, where James was coming towards her, holding a portion of burrito generously covered in sauce. When they met, he suddenly slipped, and the dish fell right on her, spreading sauce all over her shirt. Anna stood there stunned, looking at herself. Then she looked at James. whose eyes were wide open. But she saw no remorse in them. Rage engulfed her, and she was about to scream when her gaze fell on Edward, who was being hugged by Sophia. Then she just turned around and rushed out of the restaurant. There were cries behind her, but she paid no attention. Hurrying along the already dark street, Anna clenched her fists in anger, cursing everyone, including herself, for agreeing to go with them. She kept replaying the scenes of the evening in her mind, but for some reason, she wasn't as angry about being splattered with sauce. She was more furious with Sophia. She called her all sorts of names in her mind and recalled her flaws. Unnoticed, she found herself on a dark, unlit alley. The boiling point was reached. Anna wound herself up so much that she involuntarily exclaimed, "May she die, may they hang her on a rope and gouge her eyes out." After shouting these curses, she calmed down. It seemed like she managed to vent her anger. Then, looking around, she realized with relief that she was alone on the street and no one had seen her outburst. Gathering her strength, she headed towards her home. Standing on the porch and searching for her keys, she involuntarily looked around. It was the house left to her by her parents. They died when she was little. It was her sanctuary. On the porch stood a wooden rocking chair and a couple of flowers in vases. She thought she should water them tomorrow and finally calmed down as she entered the house. In the morning, waking up early, she headed to work. Yesterday's incident was still fresh in her memory, but Anna decided not to dwell on it. She thought that when she came to work, everything would clear up, and it would turn out that there was nothing serious between Edward and Sophia. The office was not far from her home, just a couple of blocks away. When she approached the building, there was no one here yet, only the security guard stood at the entrance. She walked past, and he just glanced up and then lowered his gaze back to his phone. Entering the atrium, she turned left towards the fire escape. She often used it not to attract attention. She needed to go to the third floor. When she reached it, she stopped to catch her breath. A thought flashed through her mind that she should start exercising. Then she moved on and pushed the door leading to the hallway. Suddenly, she abruptly stopped. Covering her mouth with her hand out of fright, she took 2 steps back. Before her was a horrible scene that made her tremble. Unwilling to believe what was happening, she fainted from shock. The phone rang early in the morning, causing Detective Harris to curse tiredly. He finally had a weekend off after a tough case, but apparently something had happened again. There was even a fleeting thought in his mind whether he should just ignore it and not answer, but he still reached out and grabbed his cell phone. It was his boss calling. Pressing the answer button, he said hello in a sleepy voice, but he was immediately interrupted. The boss ordered him to come urgently to the scene, and he was supposed to send the address. Putting down the phone, the detective cursed again and went to the bathroom. He arrived at the scene half an hour later. It was a large business office, a 10-story building. Opposite the entrance stood police officers organizing a cordon. Curious onlookers had gathered nearby, guessing what had happened there. The detective approached the entrance, showing his ID, and was led to the crime scene. He took the elevator to the 3rd floor and walked down the corridor towards the fire exit, where forensic experts and other police officers had gathered. As he squeezed between them, a horrific scene unfolded before him. A girl was hanging from a rope tied to the ceiling. She must have been a beauty before, but now it was terrifying to look at her. The rope tightened around her neck, her hands hung down, and various bruises were visible all over her body. But the most horrifying thing was that her eyes were gouged out. When he looked at her, It seemed like the emptiness instead of her eyes dragged you into the abyss. The detective cursed and asked the chief what had happened here. It turned out that one of her colleagues discovered the body when she was climbing up the fire escape. She fainted upon seeing it, but another passing employee found them both a little later. He asked if they had checked the cameras. One of the police officers nodded in agreement, after which he led him to the surveillance room. Surprisingly, many law enforcement officers had gathered there. The detective noticed shock and horror on their faces. He asked everyone to disperse and also started watching the footage. It seemed like nothing was happening. It was night, and the corridors were empty. But suddenly one of the windows opened and the body flew in. It seemed lifeless, but suddenly the girl moved her arms. Her eyes were already gouged out, and she seemed to be screaming, but the camera didn't capture any sound. She flew through the corridor as if carried by an unknown ghost until she reached the place where the rope was already hanging. Then something put the rope around her neck and hung her, causing her to twitch and eventually hang lifelessly. The detective couldn't believe his eyes. It was the first time he had seen something like this. Uncontrollable tremors ran through him. What was this? A ghost, a poltergeist, or something even worse? He tried to find an explanation. Perhaps the footage was fabricated. There were plenty of freaks nowadays who were willing to go to such horrible lengths for sensation. So he composed himself and decided to conduct a detailed investigation. He returned to the crime scene, intending to talk to the girl who found the body. She was sitting in the adjacent room, being examined by a psychologist. She was a 25-year-old girl of small stature with curly gray hair. She wore glasses and appeared to be a typical introvert. He began asking her questions, but she didn't respond immediately, as if in a trance. The detective realized she was in shock, so he tried to be as gentle as possible. In the end, it turned out that she worked with the victim in the same department and found the body entirely by chance. Listening to her answers, he didn't detect anything suspicious, but for some reason, his gut feeling told him otherwise. Something was off, and he intended to find out what it was. Anna was released from questioning a couple of hours later. Seeing her condition, the officer drove her home. She quietly entered the house and, reaching her bedroom, flopped onto the bed. What she saw today shocked her, but she was more frightened by the fact that her curses from yesterday had come true. It was as if someone had eavesdropped and fulfilled her wish. What could it be? At that moment, there seemed to be no one on the street. Maybe someone was following her? Or did she acquire some terrifying superpower? But whatever it was, Sophia was dead. How would her colleagues react to this? She was particularly concerned about what Edward would think. At first, she felt sorry for Sophia, but then a feeling of satisfaction began to awaken in her, as if secretly inside her, her secret desire had come true, and then a spark of hope appeared. Maybe now she could succeed with Edward. The main thing now was to pretend to be a victim and get closer to him. She gradually started to forget the morning incident and began to imagine how she would date him. The funeral took place the next day. Anna didn't want to go, but then she thought it would look bad in the eyes of others, so she went after all. There were many people at the cemetery. She saw Sarah, who was crying while sitting on a chair, and James, who had a shocked expression on his face. Edward stood next to the deceased's parents and was discussing something. Everyone had sad faces. The funeral passed quickly, and when it was over, Anna got up and headed for the exit. But then Edward caught up with her. He didn't say anything, but simply hugged her. At that moment, she felt happy. Could it be that they were getting closer to each other? Finally, he let her go and said, "It must have been terribly difficult for you to see that scene, but you must stay strong for Sophia's sake. We must go on living." Anna didn't reply, looking sad. Edward patted her on the shoulder and left. She stood there for a while, trying to remember those feelings, and then also headed for the exit. Everyone in their department was given a week off to recover from what happened. But time passed, and the terrible incident gradually faded away. When Anna came to work, she saw flowers and various condolences on Sophia's desk. Sarah was still depressed, and even looked a little thinner. The others were busy with their work. Anna walked past and took her seat. She had a lot of work to do, and she was also working on a report with James. Working with him was difficult because he only threw short phrases instead of having conversations like, "Fix this here," "Recalculate there," and so on. This job could bring a promotion or a bonus to both of them, so they were doing it with a hint of enthusiasm. But their work was interrupted by the incident with Sophia, so they had to postpone it. Now they needed to continue the calculations. James approached her with papers and threw them on the table, saying that he had worked over the weekend and she should add this data to the report. Anna looked at them and was surprised. He had done a good job. So the day passed. She was absorbed in work, but still casting short glances at Edward. During lunch, Edward called her, which surprised her. It seemed like they were getting closer to each other. Finishing work and heading home, Anna was in a good mood. Leaving the crowded street, she went the usual way. It was a private sector, and there were few people here. With each step along this deserted street, the darkness seemed to thicken. Only rare streetlights, through flickering bars of light, tried to drive away the night shadows, but their efforts were in vain. The trees, trimmed like whimsical statues, created patterns of shadow and light on the ground. Anna felt a strange, inexplicable sense of unease when she heard something rustling behind her. Footsteps? No, more like a sliding, quiet, almost imperceptible. Moving forward, she tried to convince herself that it was just leaves being stirred by the wind. But there was no wind. The air was stagnant, thick and heavy, as if the breath of the night itself. Trying not to pay attention to the growing unease, she quickened her pace. But the fading light of the street lamps seemed to not reach the darkest corners of the darkness, leaving more room for fear. At the moment when the next lamppost suddenly went out, as if exhaling its last glow, the street plunged into almost complete darkness. Her heart beat faster, echoing rhythmically in her ears. The black spot that emerged out of nowhere began to take shape a few steps behind her. It didn't have a clear form, but instinctively she felt that it was alive, something following her with unwavering persistence. With each moment it seemed to grow larger and closer. Breathing heavily, she hurried, and her footsteps echoed louder on the asphalt than her heartbeat. Creaks, rustles, and indistinct whispers began to surround her from all sides. She couldn't tell anymore if these sounds were real or just a play of her inflamed imagination. But the sense of the presence of something unseen, something frightening and unpredictable, was so palpable that panic gripped her chest with an iron grip. When she turned onto the next street, the feeling of being pursued subsided. Here were people walking, and it seemed like she had entered another world. But what was that? Her heart continued to beat strongly. Her entire being seemed to scream about danger. She looked around, trying to catch her breath and regain her composure. The sight of chatting and carefree people gradually dispelled the fear. She headed home again, but this time chose crowded streets, vowing never to walk through that scary neighborhood again. The good mood she had all day simply vanished. When she entered the house, she locked all the doors. Only then could she breathe freely. This was her home, her fortress, and sanctuary. Relaxing, she took a shower, had dinner, and then headed to her bedroom. Collapsing onto the bed, she tried to fall asleep. The day had been hard, she had done so much work, so she just wanted to fall into the arms of Morpheus. But thoughts in her head prevented her from doing so. Although her body felt tired, her head was heavy, which prevented her. She remembered that terrible chase. Someone was chasing her, but who? So she lay there for a couple of hours, tossing and turning in bed. She even tried to distract herself and read her favorite book, Carrie, but the atmosphere of horror, when she was already scared, was inappropriate. So she pushed the book aside and just stared at the ceiling. But sleep still came. She dreamed of her time in the orphanage. There she had no friends except for a couple of brothers. They were always together, like an inseparable trio. But suddenly the scene changed. Before her appeared a river, dark and mysterious, like a mirror reflecting the night sky. Suddenly, children's hands appeared in the water, floundering in a desperate attempt to grasp onto life. The hands waved, creating splashes and circles on the water's surface, then suddenly disappeared into those dark depths. Anna woke up abruptly. Sitting up, she rubbed her eyes. How many times she had tried to forget that incident, but occasionally that scene resurfaced in her memory. Suddenly, she heard noise downstairs. She sat in the darkness, listening. The strange feeling of unease she experienced in her dream didn't leave her, even when she was fully awake. The noise downstairs grew louder as someone or something dragged heavy objects across the first floor. She slowly got up from the bed and headed to the door of her room. Every step on the creaky floor seemed like thunder in the dead silence of the night. When Anna stepped into the corridor, the light from the street lamp coming through the window on the staircase created ominous shadows. They distorted and reached out to her as if trying to turn into something alive. Descending downstairs, she felt a chill run down her spine. The noises ceased as soon as she reached the ground floor, and suddenly everything plunged into dark silence. Anna tried to turn on the lights, but pressing the switch yielded no results. The electricity in the house had been cut off. Exploring the ground floor, Anna noticed that books from the shelves were scattered on the floor, and sofa cushions were ripped from their covers. On the wall, illuminated by her flashlight, she saw something horrifying. Large scratches, as if someone with sharp claws had tried to write or draw something. Returning to the staircase, she heard a sound that made her heart stop. It was a soft, almost imperceptible hissing coming from under the floorboards. The sound was as repulsive as the rustles in her nightmare. Her gaze fell on the mirror at the end of the corridor. In its surface flashed a fleeting and indescribably grim reflection, but when she turned to look, there was no one there. Suddenly, the lights in the house came on, dispersing the darkness. Anna looked around, but it seemed like whatever it was had retreated, and there was silence. Only the disorder in the room reminded her that someone had been there. But who? Had someone broken into her home? She went to check the locks on the doors and windows, but there were no signs of forced entry. She pondered what to do. Call the police, but they would think she was crazy. Fear enveloped her. She realized that even in her own home she was not safe. What should she do? And who was it or what? She rushed into her room and locked the door, where she sat until morning. Falling asleep in such an atmosphere was impossible for her. She constantly felt like someone was standing behind the door watching her. In the morning, she headed to work. Dark circles were under her eyes. She was severely exhausted. both physically and mentally. She couldn't understand what had happened to her last night, and she had no one to discuss it with. If she told Edward that a poltergeist had settled in her house, he would think she was crazy, and then it would be the end of their relationship. Arriving at work, she sat sleepily at her computer trying to concentrate but couldn't. Even her colleagues noticed her condition. So the day passed. Anna headed home, this time choosing busy, well-lit streets. Passing by one of the shops, she glanced at the window display. In it, she saw her reflection, but she also noticed a black silhouette standing next to her. She sharply turned her head, but there was no one else there. Her heart pounded furiously. She looked back at her reflection, but the silhouette was gone. What the hell is going on? She cursed and ran. When she reached her house, she quickly rushed inside. Then she locked the door and went up to her bedroom. Standing in front of the door, she realized that something was wrong. It was a sixth sense telling her not to open it, but she still went in. She found that the entire room was covered with photographs, and all the walls were scribbled with something red. The inscriptions repeated and read, "It's you who killed her." There seemed to be no free space. Everything was covered. Upon closer inspection, she realized that the photographs depicted the dead Sophia. And what was even more horrible, none of the photographs were repeated, capturing the victim in various horrifying poses. Anna was horrified. She looked around but found no one. Then she inspected the house, but it was empty. My God, what should I do? She thought. Under no circumstances could she call the police. She realized she had no one to turn to, and her loneliness, which she had cherished all along, became her weakness. Sitting on the couch in the living room, she finally calmed down and, first of all, removed all the photos and burned them in the yard. Then she went to the 24-hour supermarket and bought paint. The whole night was spent repainting the walls. By morning, she fell asleep. She woke up to a phone call. It was Edward. He asked her if everything was all right. She said she was feeling a little under the weather and would take the day off today. Then she got up and checked the time. She had only slept for a couple of hours, and honestly, she was terribly sleepy. But she needed to do one thing. She went online and found an advertisement for installing surveillance cameras. The technicians arrived quickly. The installation took all day, but it was worth it. Anna sighed tiredly and collapsed onto the bed. Sleep came to her immediately. Waking up in the morning, the first thing she did was rush to her bedroom. Fortunately, everything was the same. Fresh paint sparkled in the morning sunlight. Has the nightmare really ended? Checking the cameras, she headed to work. Today she was rested, and everything was fine at work too. Edward invited her to lunch again, and James said he had submitted their report, and they needed to wait for the management's decision. Life seemed to be getting back on track. In the evening, walking down the street, she found nothing unusual. In a cheerful mood, she opened the front door and went upstairs. Standing in front of the bedroom door, she hesitated. Has someone intruded again? But today, everything was fine. Maybe there was nothing inside either. She opened the door and realized with horror that the room was again covered with writings and photographs on the walls. Again? What the hell is happening? Anna turned sharply and ran downstairs to where the camera recordings were kept. She started playback and began scrolling to the right moment when suddenly she pressed pause sharply. This was the moment when the weirdness began. On the monitor was her bedroom. Suddenly, photographs materialized out of thin air and began sticking to the wall, after which inscriptions began to appear on the walls. It was all so creepy that Anna clasped her mouth with her hands out of fear. Then she ran to her room, packed her things, and left the house. She could no longer stay here. Finding a hotel, she booked a room and finally sighed tiredly. Some crap is happening in her house, and she won't return there until she does. As she unpacked, her hands kept trembling. Fear wouldn't leave her. Taking a shower, she lay down on the bed, afraid to fall asleep. So she lay awake all night, but sleep took its toll, and she fell asleep. In the morning, when she opened her eyes, it seemed to her that she had returned to that nightmare again. She closed them again, telling herself that it was just a dream. But upon opening them again, she found that everything remained the same. Her entire room was covered with photographs, and the walls were scribbled with blood. This horrified her so much that she wanted to run away. But then she pulled herself together. She started taking down all the photos and putting them in a bag. Then, taking a rag, she began to wipe away the writings. It was impossible to wash the walls clean, but at least no one would be able to read what was written there. After that, she went to the manager explaining the situation. She pretended that she had a mental illness and such things happened to her. In order not to involve the police, she had to pay a hefty sum. After that, she didn't go home, but headed to work. Fortunately, no one noticed her leaving with her belongings. The day passed as usual. In the evening, she finally decided to return home. Everything was as usual there. She ended up sleeping in the living room. She didn't have the strength to clean up those photos. At night, she woke up to a noise. Someone was here again. She got up and went to the kitchen where everything was in disarray. She looked at this scene with a doomed look when suddenly she heard noise upstairs. She rushed there. Her nerves were already shot. She was trembling all over. Events of the past days rushed out of her. When she burst into the bedroom, she found that all the closets were open and the things were scattered around the room. She screamed in anger, fear, and despair. "Who are you, and what do you want?" Then she collapsed to the floor and, slumping her shoulders, began to cry. Suddenly she heard a voice. "Who am I?" Anna looked up and in the darkness saw a pair of red, glowing eyes. It seemed they were hanging in the air, menacingly watching her. What kind of creature is this? She had no strength to run away and be scared. She just accepted the situation. She asked again, "What do you want from me?" "Nothing. I just found it amusing to watch you. You were so desperate that at one point I even felt sorry for you. And I decided to do you a favor. That girl who annoyed you. You were glad that I got rid of her, weren't you?" "You're insane!" Anna screamed. Hysterical laughter followed. After that, the pair of eyes dissolved into the air and there was silence. When she thought the creature had gone, she heard a voice saying, "If you ever want to get rid of someone else, just say so." After that, she sat contemplating his words. She would never make such a mistake again. She went downstairs and, collapsing on the couch, began to ponder what kind of creature it was and what to do next. But she couldn't come up with anything useful and soon fell asleep. In the morning, she went to work. Her condition was depressing. Nerves were on edge. Stress she had experienced over the past days took its toll. Her eyelid kept twitching, which annoyed her. Sitting at the table, she heard someone enter the room. It was the director of their company. He laughed loudly and went to James, shaking his hand, then patting him on the shoulder, saying he had done a good job and his report could revolutionize their business. He promised him a promotion and a big bonus, then took him away. James seemed to be in shock and wanted to say something but remained silent. He didn't even glance at Anna. She felt boiling inside. It happened again. She was ignored again. She did more than half of the work, but all the glory went to him alone. Her nerves were already on edge, and then this happened. She looked around and saw the sympathetic faces of her colleagues. Especially unpleasant was Edward's look. She jumped up and went to the bathroom. There she looked at herself in the mirror and muttered, "I hate him. I hate them all. I wish he would just drop dead. They're all driving me crazy." It was a furious and desperate curse that involuntarily burst out of her. Suddenly she heard a voice behind her. "Of course it will be done." Anna turned sharply, but there was no one there. Then she remembered what she had just said and realized what she had done. That creature had offered to help her get rid of someone if she needed to. "Oh my God, what have I done?" She rushed out of the bathroom and ran down the empty corridor. When she turned the corner, she suddenly stopped. There was a rope hanging from the ceiling, and James was hanging on it. His eyes were also gouged out just like Sophia's. Anna couldn't believe her eyes and took a couple of steps back. Suddenly, she heard a scream behind her. Turning around, she saw one of the company's employees who, with a frightened face, looked at this scene. Soon, people gathered. Trembling, Anna headed to her office and sat down at the table. When the police arrived, they cordoned off the crime scene and the interrogation began. Sarah, Edward, and Anna were called one by one into a separate room where they were thoroughly questioned. It was the same detective who was present during the first incident. When Anna returned, only Sarah was in the room. Her eyes were teary. She approached Anna and hugged her. Then, crying, she began to tell about James. It turned out that when he found out that Anna had been excluded from the report, he vehemently opposed it and argued with the director, saying that she had done all the work. He insisted so strongly that the director had to agree. Apparently, he was heading to our department to share the good news. Hearing these words, Anna collapsed to the floor. What had she done? Why couldn't she ever control her emotions? But then she heard words that shattered her entire being. Through tears, Sarah whispered, "You know, he loved you." "What?" Anna said, raising her gaze and looking at her colleague in confusion. "Yes, he loved you, but he was so shy that he was afraid to confess to you. Remember that burrito he spilled on you? He went to order it specifically for you. I kept telling him he should open up to you, but he didn't dare. He also suggested working on the report together with you because he liked you." After these words, Anna remembered all those looks he threw at her. But now it all looked different. In fact, he admired her, but he was too shy to express his feelings. Maybe he was the only person in her life who really loved her. And at that thought, everything inside her twisted and emptiness formed. She silently got up and headed for the exit. Walking through the streets, she didn't understand how she ended up at her place. She blamed herself all the time and couldn't accept this reality. Going upstairs, she found new photos in the bedroom, this time with photos of the dead James added. Collapsing to the floor, she took one of them and looked at it with empty eyes. It's unknown how long she sat like that, but suddenly she heard footsteps behind her. Turning around, she saw Edward, who stood with a stony face, looking at all the inscriptions and photos. His gaze wandered around the walls, and his eyes expressed genuine horror. Then he looked at Anna and said, I was worried about you. No matter how much I knocked, you didn't answer. Then I went up to you, but what does all this mean? What kind of monster are you?" He took a step back. Anna reached out, whispering, "Wait!" But he only looked at her as if he had seen a monster. And turning around, he ran, saying that he needed to report this to the police. She screamed in despair. How? How did everything turn out like this? Something inside her twisted and died. Then she uttered only one phrase, "Kill." After that, a voice behind her said, "It will be done." Detective Harris had been sleeping poorly for the past few days. The case with the hanged girl haunted him. But when he was called back to the same scene where a new crime had occurred, he was even more disturbed. The footage from the cameras again showed how the body hung itself in the air. Watching the new footage, he felt his hands shaking. Yes, it was fear. That instinctive fear inherent in every person when they sense danger. And again, the first one at the crime scene was that girl. He conducted an interrogation, questioning her colleagues as well, and thanks to this he learned a lot. The girl had motives against both victims, but he had no evidence. But he still decided to dig deeper under her, feeling that the solution was connected with her. And he started from that evening when they were sitting in the Mexican restaurant. Heading there, he questioned the locals, but found out nothing. Then he went down the street where the suspect could have gone, while looking for surveillance cameras. Going a little further, he ended up in a quiet neighborhood. There was no one here except for an old woman sitting on a bench holding a cat in her arms. The detective decided to talk to her and asked if she had seen anything suspicious on that day. The old woman shook her head, and when he was about to leave, she said, "Oh yes, there was something strange that evening. I was walking with my cat when she suddenly ran into the bushes. When I found her there, I saw that she was trembling all over. Something scared her. When I was about to leave, I heard cursing. Some girl was walking down the street cursing someone and wishing death. Yes, she said horrible things, but I only remembered about the gouged eyes. Then I froze and waited for her to leave." This is it, thought the detective. First, he would go to her workplace. Maybe she was still there, and he needed to find out where she lived. When he arrived at the office, he saw that the police cordon had been removed, but several people were still here. He went up to the third floor and entered the department where Anna worked. There was only one girl there, named Sarah. She was surprised by his arrival, but he explained his intentions to her and asked her to show him where Anna had been sitting. After that, he inspected her desk and started looking through the drawers. In the first one, he found various office supplies. In the second, there were candies, many of them, and they seemed expensive. But he didn't find any wrappers. In the third one, there were photographs, and as he looked through them, he felt horror. They were detailed photos of the victims. He understood everything, and, calling on the phone, said he needed a warrant. After learning Anna's address from Sarah, he informed his colleagues and hurried to his car. When he arrived at the scene, he was faced with a neat two-story house. The front door was locked, so he pulled out his weapon and entered, cautiously looking around. The ground floor was empty, so he headed to the second. But before he stepped on the last step, he discovered a horrifying sight. On the floor in the hallway sat a girl, with a bloody man lying on her lap. His pale appearance indicated that he was already dead. Blood was everywhere, and the girl, sitting with a vacant stare, was covered in it. The detective ordered her to move away from the body and raise her hands. But she didn't react. So he approached her, pulled her away from the body, and handcuffed her. Soon, the police arrived, and they took her away. In her room, he found terrifying writings made with blood. Later, forensic examination showed that it belonged to the victims. Besides that, there were photographs. They also found files on her computer, proving that she had tampered with the surveillance camera recordings in the office. How she did it was a mystery. But it turned out that there was nothing supernatural about this case. The girl was tried, and she denied everything, claiming that it was some kind of ghost. But of course, no one believed her. She was sentenced to life in prison and sent to the local jail. It seemed like the case was closed, but the detective still felt that there were some inconsistencies. That this case wasn't as simple as it seemed. A year passed, and he decided to visit this girl in prison. Talking to the wardens, he found out that she was not liked there, and from the first days the inmates constantly beat her up. When she was brought to the conference room, she looked terrible. Covered in bruises, with a vacant stare, she reluctantly answered his questions. She kept repeating that she didn't kill anyone. Unable to get anything out of her, the detective left the prison. As he was leaving, he felt a sense of bitterness, but he didn't know why. Every part of Anna's body ached. Once again, she had been beaten up. At first, she endured it, but then she started fighting back. It seemed that her animal instincts had awakened in this place, and at that moment she became terrifying. After each fight, she was sent to solitary confinement. She had gotten used to it. Even now, after the detective's interrogation, she was being taken to solitary. Entering the room, she collapsed to the floor. The darkness in the room, she was used to it. She constantly had thoughts of suicide, but something held her back. Lying on the floor, she suddenly saw glowing eyes which she hadn't seen in a long time. These pair of eyes were watching her. Then she asked what he wanted. There was no fear or any other emotions in her. He replied that he was just curious to see how she was doing. After all, he asked the local inmates to spice up her days. So it was him, thought Anna. Rage boiled inside her, all the pain and despair she felt here. It was all his doing. And then she screamed. Why was he doing this to her? What had she done to him? Why? At first, he laughed hysterically. Then his voice took on a menacing tone. Don't you remember? What you did back then by the river. Have you forgotten what you did? By the river, whispered Anna. And then memories flooded back to her. She was 8 years old back then. Her parents had died, and she had been living in an orphanage for 2 years. It was located in a picturesque place, near a beautiful river. During that time, Anna couldn't make friends with anyone. She didn't understand why everyone avoided her, but one day a pair of brothers came there. The older one was the same age as her, and the younger one was a couple of years younger. Their names were Dean and Thomas. They accepted her, and they spent time together having fun. The older one loved his brother very much and took care of him. This sparked envy and jealousy in Anna. Subconsciously, she tried to separate them, but she couldn't succeed. It seemed like the brothers sensed it and started to distance themselves from her. But the final straw was when a young couple visited the orphanage, and Thomas caught their eye. Dean didn't want to part with his brother, but he was happy for him. Anna couldn't understand that. The foster parents didn't take him right away. Instead, they brought him toys and sweets every time they visited him. Once she managed to escape the supervision of the caregivers and went to the river. When she got there, she began to contemplate the water surface. Suddenly, she heard a voice behind her calling her. It was Thomas, holding candies in his hands. Standing opposite her, he offered them to her. But something inside her flared up. The sight of this little boy enraged her. The way he reached out to her. The way he looked at her with pity. All of it drove her into a frenzy. And then she pushed him. He fell into the water and the current carried him downstream. He struggled in the water, unable to swim. She watched the scene with a sense of satisfaction as someone pushed her and jumped into the water. It was Dean. He desperately tried to save his brother, but the current carried them both away. Anna sat by the river for another half hour and then returned to the shelter, not telling the adults anything. The brothers were searched for a long time but never found. Remembering this incident, Anna looked puzzled at the pair of eyes hanging in the air. She couldn't understand how this creature was related to that incident. But as it stared at her intently, it began to materialize. First, the head appeared, and then the whole body. It was a middle-aged man, wearing an old black cloak that covered his entire body. His face was ordinary, except for a pair of glowing eyes and sharp vampire fangs that betrayed the monster within him. She tried to understand where she had seen him before and remembered it was Dean. Then she gasped, covering her mouth with her hand and backing away. He looked at her, and then he said, "Then by the river I survived. We were carried by the current for a long time, and when I managed to get to the shore, I realized that my brother was dead. Despair overwhelmed me. I cried and wept, for I loved my younger brother so much. Besides him, I had no one left. But now I was alone. Despair turned into rage and anger. I wanted to kill you immediately. The scene where you pushed him kept replaying in my mind. I wanted revenge. But simply killing you was not enough for me. You had to feel all the pain and despair that I felt. For that, I needed strength. I wandered through the forest when I heard a call. Following it, I found a small hut where I found a book. To my surprise, it described the method of immortality and boundless power. I couldn't believe this coincidence, but I still started to learn. Time passed, and I ceased to be human. It was time for vengeance. But to my disappointment when I found you, it turned out that you were still so pathetic. At that time, you were studying in college, but even there, you had no close people. So I waited. Finally, you got a job, and someone important appeared in your life. That's when I started to act. You know the rest. Anna listened to his story and gasped for breath. She couldn't believe how life had turned out because of that incident. After all, she just wanted to live. She wanted to live. Reading her thoughts, the vampire said, "My brother wanted to live too. But when he showed compassion to you, you simply got rid of him. Just like you got rid of your colleagues." Anna was in despair. Her eyes darted around the room. She jumped up and screamed for security. She wanted to survive. She felt that her end was near. But the vampire just laughed. "No one will help you. They are all in a deep sleep. I forgot to tell you that for using these powers, my soul will be taken to hell. But I won't go there alone." After that, he grabbed her and enveloped her in his cloak. She screamed, but it was too late. They were both engulfed in flames so intense that they melted the bars on the door. Anna screamed in pain, but Dean only looked at her. There was no fear of death in his eyes, only a sense of duty fulfilled as well as peace. The flames burned them both, leaving behind only a handful of ashes.
Story 2.
I was very fond of Amanda. She was like a refreshing stream quenching my thirst after a long journey. We first crossed paths in a bar one spring in 1970. Both of us were about 30 years old, and it was our first visit to that place, notorious for its overly bitter coffee. Our eyes met before we even exchanged words. Today, they might call it a spark. There was an instant attraction, and our conversation soon took on a flirtatious tone. Amanda Fisher. She was one of those rare people where cynicism and romanticism lived in harmony. Charismatic and always smiling, she even insulted with a smile on her lips. To others, Amanda seemed the epitome of idleness and narcissism. She had a way of enchanting and intoxicating those around her, but I was lucky enough to see her without the mask. The more our relationship deepened, the more she revealed her true self to me. It turned out she was not immune to melancholy, and her excessive cheerfulness was somewhat of a facade she maintained in social settings. Amanda would often sit by the window for hours, writing brief notes she never showed to anyone. Sometimes, I saw tears streaming down her face as she wrote. Despite her cynical view of life and people, Fisher had a gentle side. She was also big-hearted, showing genuine compassion and generosity towards animals and people alike. One time during a stroll, we encountered an elderly homeless man who had run into a group of rowdy, drunken youths and had been beaten. He lay on the filthy pavement. Without a moment's hesitation, Amanda approached him, extending a hand clad in her new beige gloves. She helped the man to his feet and handed him several large bills. The sparkle of empathy in her eyes made her even more beautiful in that moment. My admiration for her grew the more I got to know her. The most joyous part for me was that my feelings were reciprocated. Amanda was both a tender companion and a passionate lover. 3 months after our meeting, we began living together in her house. The romantic fairy tale lasted about a year. How I wished it could have been for a lifetime. Early in our relationship, Fisher warned me that she tended to fall out of love quickly, which had earned her a reputation for frivolity. At the time, I foolishly thought I would be the exception. I believed our love was unique. Later, I would look back on that belief with a rueful smile. It was a surprisingly chilly evening for midsummer when Amanda announced she had to leave, claiming she wasn't suited for long-term romance. She avoided my gaze, her expression troubled and embarrassed. I was devastated, yet my pride prevented me from begging for scraps of affection or promising that I could change her mind. I thanked her for her honesty, gathered my belongings, and quickly exited her life. Life moved on gradually, but not a day passed without thoughts of Amanda, yearning for her, and feeling heartache. I continued to love her for a very long time. Only in the summer of 1972 did I begin to feel free of her grip. Memories of our passionate past no longer haunted me daily. Many long days passed before the sharp pain of those memories faded. In the winter of 1973, I received a letter from Amanda. My heart skipped a beat. I sat in my favorite armchair, envelope in hand, deeply contemplating. Knowing her fickle nature, Fisher could very well be attempting to reignite my affection. She had always been persuasive with words, and I feared her charm might ensnare me once more. Our relationship had died, and resurrecting what had been committed to the earth was impossible. I knew this well, but I feared my heart, fueled by memory, might betray me. Ultimately, I burned the letter without opening it, and life moved forward. Then, unexpectedly, like lightning striking an ancient tree and splitting it in half, I received a letter in the autumn of 1975 from Joanna Fisher. She informed me that her sister, Amanda, had passed away suddenly and invited me to the funeral. I knew Amanda had sisters. At the peak of our romance, we had visited the Fisher family estate together. We stayed there for a few days, during which she introduced me to Anna. They shared similar facial features: a small, straight nose, cool, light green eyes, full lips, and sharply chiseled cheekbones, a beauty both alluring and slightly predatory. Unlike Amanda, whose hair was slightly curly and who had perfect vision, Anna wore glasses and always kept her hair tied up in a bun. Amanda mentioned they had another sister, Joanna, who was traveling in Europe at the time. It struck me as peculiar that nature had granted them such identical appearances, as triplets are exceedingly rare. Yet I never quite grasped the nature of Amanda's relationship with Anna. It was hard to believe they were very close. The news of her death shook me. She was just over 30. I needed to know what had happened. Was she ill? Had there been an accident? Joanna's letter was silent on the details. I set off for her family estate the same day. Autumn, 1941. Elizabeth felt an overwhelming weakness, yet her paleness lent her an even more aristocratic elegance, exactly what she aimed for. She finished her blood drink and set the empty glass atop the piano. The skirt of her black satin dress rustled as Mrs. Fisher emerged from her bedroom. Lately, the maids had grown fearful of their mistress, whispering among themselves that she had sold her soul to the devil. It was no secret in town that Elizabeth believed drinking blood would grant her eternal life and youth. After giving birth to triplets, girls, Mrs. Fisher had seemed even more enigmatic to her servants. Her blue eyes had taken on an unhealthy gleam, her skin had turned as white as flour, and her nose seemed slightly sharper. She moved slowly around the vast house, her gaze fixed grimly ahead. The woman dressed exclusively in mourning attire, striking terror into her servants. She walked down the corridor and entered the sitting room, furnished with black furniture imported from Europe. She intended to give instructions to Lily, but her strength was fading. Her head spun, her vision blurred, and she lay down on the couch. 2 hours later, she was found by the elderly servant Megan. "Mrs. Fisher, forgive me," Megan called out cautiously. "Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Fisher has arrived. Ma'am?" Approaching closer, Megan saw that Elizabeth wasn't breathing. Her heart skipped a beat as she touched the white hand lying on Elizabeth's abdomen, checking for a pulse. There was none. Mrs. Fisher's skin was so pale it seemed to glow faintly in the dim room. Is she truly dead? Megan wondered fearfully. The dead woman lying dead suddenly opened her eyes wide. Megan screamed in horror and collapsed to the floor. Many years later, the Fisher estate. When I arrived at the estate, the rain had just started to drizzle. The large 3-story house, made of gray stone with Gothic towers reaching into the overcast sky, remained unchanged. The estate was not far from a bustling little town. To the right of it stretched a forest. To the left lay a lake, concealing a small grove. Amanda once mentioned that the townspeople were inexplicably afraid of the swamp in the nearby forest. I recalled this as I walked along the well-kept driveway towards the main entrance. The butler, Benjamin, had been in the Fishers' employ for many years. I recognized him, but he seemed not to recognize me. After a restrained greeting, the old man left and returned with Joanna a few minutes later. Amanda's sister shared her features, and my heart involuntarily skipped a beat. Only Joanna dyed her hair red, and it appeared slightly tousled, while her gaze, unlike Amanda's and Anna's, seemed particularly serious and stern. "Good afternoon. Kevin Norton," I introduced myself. "Good afternoon. It's good to see you. I hope you didn't encounter any problems on your way here?" the girl asked me. "A bit tired. However, it's not important. Please accept my deepest condolences. Amanda was a beautiful person." My voice trembled. Perhaps it all sounded naive, but I truly knew what she was like. "Thank you," Joanna replied grimly. "My question may seem tactless, but could you tell me how it happened?" "Heart failure. Strange, as she never complained. My sister died in her bed." Her voice sounded steely for some reason. She was still young. Was her heart really that weak? I asked with a hint of doubt. "Yes, that's what the doctor said, and he has a lot of experience. We have no reason not to trust him." Well, we're still standing in the hallway. Let's go to the living room. The funeral will start soon. The Fisher family cemetery was not far from the grove. The gloomy Gothic crypt instilled a sense of foreboding, and the rain only intensified, drumming heavily on the stone grave slabs. I was able to see Amanda only before the burial itself. When the grave diggers lifted the lid of the coffin, I was overwhelmed with emotions. She was beautiful. It hurt and saddened me deeply. Whoever said, "Death disfigures." She gently kissed the girl, smoothing the wrinkles around her eyes. Her porcelain skin seemed so smooth that I felt an overwhelming urge to touch it. The 4 years we hadn't seen each other had passed for Amanda without a trace. She hadn't changed at all, still slender and elegant. Unable to bear it, I stepped forward sharply, causing the gravediggers to flinch, and touched the tips of my fingers to her cheek. "Goodbye," I whispered. It smelled of rain and damp earth. I stepped back, the coffin lid closed, and the burial began. The dining room was somber and dark, much like the entire house. Brown wallpaper with golden motifs, antique oak furniture, and heavy tapestries on the windows all exuded an air of antiquity and tranquility. Joanna, Anna, and I sat at the long table enjoying the meal. The Fisher's cook had prepared exceptionally well, and my appetite, dormant since I learned of Amanda's passing, reawakened. The lamps cast a cold light, and ephemeral shadows crawled along the walls as the rain outside turned into a downpour. The vagabond wind whistled relentlessly in the old window frames. In such weather, there was nothing better than sitting by the fireplace with a book in hand, or to sleep. But I didn't want to sleep, because before my inner eye, there stood a coffin with Amanda lying in it. "Mr. Norton, would you like to stay with us for a while?" Joanna asked, breaking the melancholic silence. "Thank you for the invitation, but I wouldn't want to impose on your hospitality," I replied. I glanced at the sisters and noticed that they exchanged quick glances. There was something unsettling in their gaze, but it wasn't clear what exactly. During those years when I hadn't been at the estate, Anna had fallen from a horse and lost the ability to move independently. Now she was confined to a wheelchair and seemed even more withdrawn than before. Sitting in the dining room and enjoying the wonderful dinner, I could see that the sisters' inner states differed. Anna seemed lost, embarrassed, and tense, while Joanna appeared gloomy and resolute. In those moments, my doubts about Amanda's death became clearer and more weighty. Suddenly, I thought that it wasn't such a bad idea to stay. Perhaps I could uncover the truth about what happened to the one I once loved immensely. "You see, you were close to our sister. It's important to us," Joanna said, twirling a silver fork in her fingers and staring intently at its tines. "We would be pleased if you stayed here. As you've already noticed, Anna is now confined to a wheelchair and misses the company terribly. We miss our sister very much, and it would be wonderful if you stayed and told us what she was like with you. I hope you understand us." After a brief reflection, I nodded politely and said, "All right, thank you for the invitation." The rest of the dinner passed in silence. Afterward, the old servant Benjamin led me to the northern part of the mansion and left me in one of the rooms on the second floor. Most of the rooms were dimly lit, and from the walls of the corridor, medieval people grimly gazed at me from their portraits, with something unkind in their eyes. My room was cool, but had a fireplace and a separate bathroom. Dark purple wallpaper, black lacquered furniture, a wide bed with a canopy, and a wardrobe with a cracked mirror, a gloomy beauty. After warming up in the hot water, I lit the fireplace and lay down in bed. The soft embrace of the blanket and mattress carried me into the world of dreams. The day had been very tense. When I woke up, for a few moments I couldn't understand where I was. This house looked more like a landmark than a residential space. That was the first thought that crossed my mind. I arose, washed, and dressed in a fresh suit. The rain had ceased, and an unusual stillness enveloped the outdoors. The windows were misted, and the fire crackled soothingly in the fireplace. I approached the window, attempting to discern the landscape surrounding the mansion, but a thick gray fog obscured my view. Exiting the bedroom, I made my way down the expansive, lengthy corridor toward the grand staircase. Recalling the route Benjamin had shown me the previous day, I quickly reached the ground floor. The silence here was profound, the kind not even found in the deepest woods. I paused, immersed in the quiet, before moving towards the room with glass doors. It turned out to be one of the many salons, where guests and residents likely enjoyed coffee and pastries, smoked cigars, and debated politics. My hand brushed the phonograph as I surveyed the room. Numerous books, vases, and figurines filled the glass door cabinets, and the lilac velvet upholstered sofas and armchairs evoked a Rococo style. My eyes settled on an open black box on the table. Drawing nearer, I discovered it contained photographs. My hand shook as I lifted the top card. It was a photo of Amanda. The shock was palpable. Clearly, the picture had been taken shortly after her demise. But why photograph the deceased? This Victorian-era practice, both grim and peculiar, involved capturing images of the dead. While macabre, these photographs served as tangible memories for the bereaved. Decades later, the practice seemed all the more ghastly, yet I found myself unable to look away from the photo card. Amanda's eyes, glassy and nearly transparent, stared back at me. She remained as pale and elegant as ever. Tracing my finger over the photograph, a sad smile crossed my lips. In that moment, I found solace in this beautiful remembrance, where Amanda appeared almost as she had in life. I began examining the other photographs, my heart pounding as I realized all featured my former lover. The sisters had spared no expense on film and a photographer. There were enough photos to fill an entire album. In some, Amanda posed with Anna and Joanna. In others, just with one of them. "It's like she's alive, isn't it?" Joanna's voice startled me. I dropped the photo back into the box and turned around. She stood a few steps away, smiling, though her eyes were watchful and cold. To be honest, I was a bit taken aback by these photos. "But they are remarkable shots," I replied earnestly. "Thank you. You see, my sister and I were very close. Triplets always have a special bond. Losing Amanda, I lost something profoundly significant," Fisher said absent-mindedly, adjusting her dress, which beautifully accentuated her figure. "I don't have any siblings, so I can only imagine how hard it is for you." "Who are your parents, Kevin?" she inquired with interest. "My father owned a small bookstore. He passed away 6 years ago. And my mother, I scarcely remember her. She died from cancer when I was just 7, I explained. I turned back to the box and closed it with the nearby lid. "I'll definitely need to ask for one of those cards before I leave," I thought to myself. "My condolences," Joanna replied politely. "Our father was always so absorbed in expanding his business. He seldom came home, but when he did, it was a cause for celebration." I turned to Fisher and nodded understandingly. "We didn't share such a bond with our mother," she added. "Well, it's time for breakfast. Let's go." We left the salon and headed towards the dining room, located at the opposite end of the long corridor. For breakfast, there was a delectable omelet with mushrooms and cheese, paired with crispy bacon. Following the meal, we savored coffee and engaged in light conversation. I discovered that Amanda was the first of the sisters to leave the mansion. She had a strained relationship with her father, who was adamant that his daughters contribute to the family business, a sewing factory. But Amanda, ever the dreamer and impulsive spirit, left home at 16 to forge her own path. A year after her departure, their father died, and the factory was inherited by the sisters. However, only Joanna, ever the pragmatist, took an active role in its management, while Anna, with her passion for science, pursued a career in medicine. "Did you and Anna always live in this house?" I inquired, taking a sip of my coffee. "No. I returned here a couple of years ago. I spent most of my time in Europe managing factory affairs," she replied, placing her cup back on the saucer and fixing me with a steady gaze. "To be honest, I was eager to meet you. Anna always spoke very highly of you, and while sorting through Amanda's belongings, I found a few lines she wrote about you. So I thought it only fitting to invite you to the funeral. We were very close. I always remember your sister fondly, or with a tinge of sadness," I said, picking up a snow-white napkin from the table and twirling it between my fingers. "Forgive my directness, but why did you two part ways?" Joanna inquired. "She moved on. You know Amanda? She was incredibly free-spirited and impulsive. Her feelings simply changed," I explained, now able to speak of our past without pain, albeit with a hint of nostalgia. "Yes, we're quite the opposites in that respect," Joanna responded coolly. "Why didn't Anna come down for breakfast?" "She prefers to eat in her room. Sadly, my sister hardly ever leaves her bedroom these days," Fisher said, glancing away and looking out the window at the gloomy autumn day. "Perhaps I should pay her a visit. What do you think?" I suggested, wanting to be courteous. "That would be wonderful. I'm sure she would appreciate your company." "Thank you. Then I shall do just that," I said, tilting my head slightly and smiling. Fisher stood, adjusted her dress once more, and prepared to leave. "I must go now, but I'll be back for dinner. Please make yourself at home. If you need anything, just ask Benjamin." Joanna left. "Oh, good morning. Nice to see you." Anna sat up a little higher in her bed as I entered her room. "Good morning. It's rarely sunny in these parts, isn't it?" My expressive gaze fell on the window. It seemed the fog was thickening. Like the rest of the state, Fisher smirked and gestured for me to sit in the armchair. "How are you feeling?" I asked, sitting down and crossing my legs. Anna reached for the bedside table, grabbed her glasses, and put them on. Her hair was down, and she looked very attractive. "My legs ache. It's the weather. I, would prefer to live somewhere in the south of France, in the dry warmth. But I have to make do with this ominous damp mansion." The girl's voice was tinged with irony. "But you have all the means to move to France." "True. But in my condition, it's problematic. And now?" Fisher unexpectedly fell silent and rubbed her nose. Her behavior seemed strange to me. "Now? Now that Amanda's gone, someone has to look after the estate." I decided that Anna was hiding something. Firstly, there was clearly a steward in the mansion as well as Joanna who could handle the affairs perfectly well. Secondly, Fisher's gaze betrayed a strange concern which had no explanation. She seemed afraid. "It's fine during the day here, but in the evening..." Anna glanced out the window, her face growing even paler. "What happens here in the evenings?" "Oh, nothing really." She waved her hand dismissively and tried to smile. "Do you play bridge?" "Yes, sometimes." "We could play in the evening. What do you say?" "I'd be delighted." My gaze lingered on the photograph in the wooden frame on the coffee table next to my armchair. I carefully picked it up, The picture captured the entire family. A tall, fair-haired man with neat mustaches stood next to a stern-looking woman, dressed in a lavish black dress. Her expression was unreadable, and her face seemed unnaturally pale. Long hair cascaded down her shoulders and reached the ground. The man held 2 little girls in dresses in his arms, while the third stood next to the woman, clutching the hem of her dress. Our mother and father. We were 3 years old here, Anna said, her voice echoing hollowly. After a moment of heavy silence, I gently placed the frame back and turned to face her. You're a doctor, aren't you? Yes. Don't you find Amanda's death peculiar? A cardiac arrest without any prior symptoms? No, trust me, it's not unusual. These things do happen, she replied hastily, too hastily, then coughed into her fist. I think I need some rest now. Excuse me. Of course, I said, barely concealing a smirk, and exited the room. In the evening, Bridge? Anna's voice floated after me. I descended the stairs and explored the southern part of the first floor. When I reached the corridor where the servants' quarters were located, I decided to ascend to the 3rd floor, roaming through it like it was a museum, my hands nervously clasped together. Anna's demeanor had deepened my suspicion that Amanda's death was anything but natural. Suddenly, a sound interrupted my thoughts. I paused to listen. It persisted, a rhythmic thumping against a wall. Advancing a few steps, I found myself before a door where the noise originated. The knocking was soft yet insistent. I grabbed the metal handle and turned it, but the door remained locked. The knocking continued, followed by a whisper so faint I could swear it emanated from within the locked room. Blood, blood, blood. The words chilled the air. A wave of fear washed over me as the whispering grew more anxious, then ceased as abruptly as it had begun. I tried the handle again, hoping the door would yield, but it remained steadfast. Who are you? Why are you locked up? I asked, yet received no response. Silence hung heavily. The situation felt increasingly odd. Needing to clear my mind, I donned my coat and left the mansion. The fog enveloped the landscape, and I wandered long enough that I feared I had lost my way, the murky sea seemingly ready to swallow me. But suddenly, I was back at the front entrance. A figure emerged from the milky fog. "Sir?" a hoarse voice called out. Approaching the porch, I recognized it was Benjamin. "Seemed like you were lost," he remarked cautiously, his hands clasped behind him. "No, just needed some fresh air," I replied, my voice betraying a hint of unease. "Perhaps some coffee? Lizzie's made some excellent chocolate donuts." "Thank you." Though my appetite was lacking, I couldn't miss the chance to converse with Benjamin, who knew the mansion and its secrets well. We re-entered the house, where Benjamin took my coat, and I settled into the dining room, ready to uncover more of the mansion's mysteries. After a while, the servant brought a tray with a silver plate of golden brown donuts. After nodding politely, the old man seemed poised to leave, but I was resolute. "And what's in that room? Or rather, who?" "In the room." The man paused, his gray eyebrows rising comically. "On the 3rd floor, next to the library," I pressed, fixing my gaze on the servant. "Oh, I'm not sure I follow," the elderly butler answered with a hint of condescension. "What else could it be but just another room? Why is it locked then?" "It requires repairs, so it was locked. The estate is vast, as you've surely noticed. The ladies invest a great deal in maintaining this house, but they aren't magicians, and some rooms are yet to be restored," Benjamin retorted sharply. "I heard whispers. They came from that room," I insisted. "You must have been mistaken. Forgive me for suggesting it." The servant offered a cold smile. In this house, many things may seem peculiar, but they are merely plays of sound and light. Or do you suspect the ladies of harboring someone secretly?" A tense silence fell over us. "No, of course not. You're probably right. I must have imagined it," I muttered under my breath, taking a sip of coffee. "May I be excused, sir?" I didn't look up at the butler, but I could sense his smirk. "Yes, you may go." After finishing the coffee, I returned to my room and tried to divert my thoughts with reading. Rain had begun to fall. It drummed monotonously against the window panes, streaking the glass with wet trails, and the fog remained undispelled. The medieval romance only slightly diverted my thoughts from Amanda. I couldn't pinpoint what was guiding me, but a conviction had taken hold that something sinister was amiss here, and it wasn't merely a series of coincidences. Let Benjamin think he could fool me. I was certain I had truly heard those knocks and whispers. They weren't figments of my imagination. The resolve to access that room grew stronger, yet I knew I had to proceed with utmost caution and discretion. As I watched the raindrops trace patterns on the window, I drifted unknowingly into sleep. I dreamed of a summer day in a quaint village in southern France, a place I had never visited, yet recognized in my dream with its blooming landscapes. Amanda, clad in white, sat on the vibrant green grass, biting into a juicy red apple. My heart fluttered. Fisher's skin appeared so pale and smooth under the quivering sunlight that I yearned to touch it. Amanda smiled, inhaling the scent of flowers and a nearby shimmering blue lake. "It's lovely here. I'm glad we came," she said, looking directly into my eyes with a smile that soon turned serious. As she reached out to touch my cheek, I saw her with glasses and her hair pulled back in a bun. The vividness of her touch jolted me awake. In the room, there was no one. Outside, the fog had turned the evening opaque, casting a ghostly glow through the dark windows. As I sat enveloped in the gathering gloom, I was almost certain that someone had indeed touched my cheek. It was no mere figment of my imagination. I rose abruptly, the book tumbling to the floor with a loud thud. Peering into the shadows of the bedroom, I shook my head in a desperate attempt to clear it. Yet the room remained empty. Just then, a knock at the door made me start. "Yes?" I called out, my voice rough as I wiped the sweat from my brow. "Miss Anna expects you for bridge," came the butler's muffled voice through the door. "I'll be down shortly, thank you." The prospect of a bridge game seemed like a welcome distraction, a potential balm for my nerves, particularly with a skilled opponent. My fondness for card games was well known. It had nearly led me to ruin until I recognized the dangerous path of nightly gambling sessions. My time with Amanda had transformed me. I began to cherish the simpler moments that I had previously overlooked, becoming more measured in my choices. "I don't want you to lose everything," Amanda had whispered softly as we lay together once. Her words had made me acutely aware of the risks involved in gambling, large bets that often ended in losses. I had resolved to prove myself worthy of Fisher's regard, vowing to eschew wagering sums of money. Gradually, the lure of gambling houses faded. "You've lost," I declared, laying down my final card. Anna made a face and sighed, then chuckled. "I'm just getting the hang of bridge, Mr. Norton." "I have no doubt you will," I assured her. "Our grandfather was an exceptional player," she remarked, taking a sip of her red wine. "Were you close to him?" "Quite. He was a remarkable man, but sadly, he passed when we were 7. Anna, may I count on your candor?" I wasn't sure if I truly expected honesty or was merely provoking her. "Of course." "What did you mean earlier about something being amiss in this house during the evenings?" Fisher averted her gaze, taking another sip of wine. She seemed lost in thought, staring into the fire that crackled brightly in the fireplace. "I ask not out of mere curiosity," I added cautiously. "Today, I heard whispers from a locked room on the 3rd floor." At this, Anna turned sharply towards me, her eyes, bright as Amanda's, flashing strangely in the firelight. "Mr. Norton, you must understand that my sister and I ourselves are baffled by what's happening here." "How is that possible?" "You see, Amanda was the first to notice the oddities. Joanna, being too pragmatic, dismissed them as mere superstitions. But eventually, even she heard and saw something terrifying. She hasn't shared the details with me." "And you? Have you witnessed anything?" I asked, my fingers tightening around the armrests of the chair. "I too have heard whispers from that room," she replied, her lips quivering. "We opened it, but found no one inside. Being a doctor with patients to consider, I refuse to be labeled a superstitious fool. It's easier to accept that my dear sister simply succumbed to heart failure." "So you're not convinced?" I pressed, my voice rising with my emotion. "I'm not sure," Anna admitted with a nod. "What if something she saw frightened her to death?" Outside, thunder chuckled ominously, its laughter echoing through the fog-enshrouded landscape. We sat in silence for a moment, the rain intensifying, its taps on the window looking inquisitive. Suddenly, I spotted a dark figure outside the window, its face pressed against the glass. It seemed that the shadowy eyes were staring right into mine. "Who is that?" I whispered. Anna followed my gaze. "You see it too?" "Yes." Propelled by a surge of adrenaline, I leaped from the chair and burst outside. The rain instantly drenched me. Nearly blind, I stumbled down the porch steps and halted, finding no one near the window where I had seen the figure. The person couldn't have gone far, I thought as I plunged into the darkness. The fog wrapped around me, thick and manipulative. Initially, I ran, breathing heavily, my breath visible in the cold air. But exhaustion soon slowed my pace to a weary trudge. The dampness was so pervasive it felt as though I was wading through an ocean. The fog played tricks on me, and no matter how far I ran, no trees or walls materialized to stop me. This endless foggy maze seemed to mock my efforts. When dread finally gripped my soul and my strength ebbed away, I fell to my knees and buried my face in my hands. The rain intensified, as if threatening to flood this cursed place. I heard rustling sounds nearby, as if someone was circling me, but the curtain of rain and fog obscured any sight of them. I coughed, rubbed my stinging eyes, and then darkness claimed me. My eyelids felt as heavy as lead. When I regained consciousness, it took a long while to orient myself. As my memories flooded back, they came with such force I feared I might lose my sanity. A bleak light spilled through the window on this overcast day. I found myself pondering who the figure at the window was and where they had vanished to. Once again, a burning desire to uncover the truth gripped me. The door opened, and Joanna entered the bedroom. She wore a dark green, austere dress that contrasted strikingly with her fiery red hair, making her look quite remarkable. Her expression was troubled, and she slightly furrowed her brow. "Thank God you're awake," she said as she sat down on the chair next to the bed. Her probing gaze swept across my face. "How are you feeling?" "Fair enough," I replied hoarsely, noticing a slight pain in my throat. "What happened? How did I end up here?" "I found you near the cemetery, unconscious. Anna and Benjamin were looking for you on the other side of the house. My sister mentioned you had run after someone." "Yes. There was someone peering through the window." I propped myself up on my elbows, coughing. "Thank you for your help." "It's nothing. You've heard something strange too, right?" Anna mentioned that Amanda might have died after encountering something. "There's something wrong in this house, isn't there?" "Don't worry about that now. You need to focus on getting better," Joanna said with a frown. "It's just a cold. But I need to find out what happened to Amanda, you understand? I must..." I whispered fervently before lying back down. "Understandable, of course. We'll figure it all out once you're feeling better," she replied softly, placing her warm, soft hand in mine. For a moment, we simply looked into each other's eyes. Yes, Joanna shared facial features with Amanda, yet she was distinctly different. Even if both sisters had the same hairstyle, each retained her individuality, though I couldn't quite pinpoint how I sensed this distinction. "I'm touched by your determination to discover what happened to Amanda," Joanna said, her hand still in mine. "Could I ever care so deeply for someone who left me? I don't think so. You see, I can't hold any resentment toward her. She made part of my life. Real, complete, meaningful. Amanda did nothing wrong to me, except for leaving. But perhaps it was meant to be. She was so beautiful and young. She didn't deserve such an end." My voice trailed off as I felt the fever typical of a cold rising. Joanna fetched a glass of herbal infusion from the nightstand and gently encouraged me to take a few sips. I felt a twinge of disappointment as her warm touch left my fingers. "Kevin, you are a worthy man. I'm glad you are here with us," she said, looking deeply into my eyes. At that moment, a wave of unusual calm washed over me. My eyelids grew heavy, and slowly, I drifted off into a realm of dreams. 1941. Two stood by the grave. "I'm not sure, but the master might find out," the man in the black suit began. "He loves me. His love has blinded him. Just do as I say," the woman replied. "But can't we handle this differently? The girls, they are..." The man in the suit hesitated. "Don't be silly. I gave birth to them. You know? Our destinies are closely linked. They are my daughters. Neither they nor I have a choice." The woman sighed deeply. "This maid Megan was always too curious," she continued, shifting the topic. "You arranged a decent funeral for her. Ensure there are fewer questions in the house about her untimely demise," she commanded coldly, her gaze imperious upon the man. "As you wish, Mistress Elizabeth." Butler Benjamin bowed before her. Autumn 1975. Thunder rumbled outside. The rain intensified. I was burning with fever. Joanna had long left the estate. She had urgent matters at the factory. The maids, the butler, and Anna tended to me. "Mr. Norton, please, you should take this medicine." Anna was persistent, but unfortunately my condition was only getting worse. I kept dreaming of Amanda. She stood on the shore of the ocean, massive waves crashing around us, seemingly ready to engulf us. The girl cried and begged me to read the letter I had received before her death and had burned. I tried to approach her, to embrace her, to comfort her, but Amanda kept slipping away, farther and farther. The waves carried her away from me. I started to suffocate, finding it difficult to breathe, and I woke up. My body was drenched in sweat, feeling both cold and hot, enveloped by darkness. I couldn't see anything, not even my own hands, but I felt someone's breath nearby, very close, warm, and familiar. Suddenly a light fell on my hands and I saw a letter. That same letter from Amanda. It was wet from tears. I opened it and saw only one word: help. At that moment, a woman dressed entirely in black entered the room. She began to laugh loudly and tried to strangle me. I heard her hysterical voice repeating my name. "Kevin, Kevin, Kevin." Mr. Norton, Norton. Mr. Norton, wake up, Kevin, open your eyes. Anna's voice brought me back to reality. I saw the same Gothic-style ceiling, the lamp emitting a soft yellow light on the table, and by the bed, a worried Anna. Mr. Norton, you have a high fever. You need to be hospitalized. I fear I made a mistake by deciding to treat you at home. Kevin, we must take you to the hospital, Anna said anxiously. I struggled to turn my head and looked at her. She was as beautiful as Amanda. Her eyes, her lips, her chest rising with excitement. Everything about her reminded me of my former love. Did you know your sister wrote to me? I said with difficulty, ignoring Anna's suggestions to take me to the hospital. Back then, I burned the letter, something I regret now. But I understand everything now. I tried to get up, but lacked the strength. Please, Mr. Norton, you need rest. Anna tried to stop me. Miss Fisher, I want to say, Amanda came to me in a dream. I couldn't make out her words, but I gasped for breath. She was pleading with me to save you and Joanna. I'm certain she was begging me to save both of you. Mr. Norton, please stop, you're delirious. Anna attempted to give me some water. We need to leave this place immediately, I insisted. Mistress, do you require assistance? The butler suddenly entered the room. Benjamin, Mr. Norton needs to be taken to a hospital, Anna pleaded, her eyes imploring the servant. I'll take care of everything. You need not worry, mistress. I'll assist you back to your room. And they both departed, leaving me alone in anxiety. I attempted to rise, but once again my strength abandoned me. Suddenly my door creaked and I heard footsteps. They were faint, as if someone were barely touching the ground. I felt gusts of cold wind and what seemed like a faint whisper in the shadows of the room. Yet I saw no one, no figure, no shadow. Someone was in the room with me, observing me. I felt his presence, but my eyes could not discern them. Who's there? I called out, my voice tinged with fear. I know you're here. Who are you? What do you want? I continued, my voice growing louder. Leave us. Leave this house. If you are a ghost, rest in peace, I declared loudly and decisively, staring into the void. Suddenly, the lamp on the table flickered out, and the entire room was plunged into darkness. A chill swept over my back. I felt a touch on my neck. What do you want? I cried out in despair. Blood and you, came a sinister whisper from a woman. At that moment, I lost consciousness. My mind ceased to obey me. I felt myself falling into an abyss. I was unsure of where I was, who I was, and what was transpiring around me. When I regained my senses, the butler was before me, seated very close on the bed, rolling up my sleeves, injecting me with a red substance. What is this? What have you just injected me with? I demanded, trying to rise. To my surprise, I felt much improved. The fever and pain had vanished. Sir, you need not worry. Your health is no longer in jeopardy, Benjamin stated as he rose from the bed and took a seat in the chair. I must confess, I poisoned you. It was my fault you were ill, he admitted, catching me off guard. I don't understand. What do you mean? I asked, slightly disoriented, my thoughts swirling. I beg your forgiveness, but I had to do it. Mistress Elizabeth does not tolerate delays. The butler apologized, bowing his head. When he looked up again, he smiled. I froze in fear, unable to believe what I saw. Instead of teeth, he had fangs, pearly white, large, and arranged in several rows like those of a shark. Who are you? What are you? I exclaimed in terror. Ah, I know. You have many questions, and soon you will learn everything. However, right now I must inform you that Lady Anna and Lady Joanna They are gone. They have left us and this estate. Mistress Elizabeth took care of that. What? What are you saying? Anna? She was supposed to take me to the hospital today. She couldn't have left the house. You escorted her to the room and... I tried to recall what had transpired. Ah, you're referring to that. You might be misremembering. Please look out the window, the butler suggested gently. I heeded the butler's advice and gazed out the window. At that moment, it felt as if my heart stopped. The scene before me was far more unsettling than Benjamin's sharp teeth. Snow blanketed everything in sight, thick and white. Winter had arrived. It is now deep winter. You have been asleep for over 4 months. However, transitioning can be quite a prolonged process, something I've personally experienced in the past, all under the directives of Mistress Elizabeth, the butler remarked with a smirk. What are you saying? I don't understand, I stammered, my head spinning and my body weak. The past is like smoke. It fades, and you will forget yours. We all undergo this, Benjamin explained thoughtfully. I trust you will come to serve the mistress's will faithfully. She can be capricious and at times unbearable. He chuckled bitterly, his sharp teeth glistening. Thanks to her whims, you have been granted entry into our rather exclusive community. It's a gift, and I must confess, I'm slightly envious of you. I attempted to rise again, but fatigue overcame me. Weakly, I turned away from the butler and looked out the window once more. In the reflection, I saw my own image, thin, pale, and the worst part was my eyes. They were as black as night, and instead of teeth, I had fangs, just like Benjamin's. If your eyes trouble you, it's only temporary. They will normalize after the full transition, and in time, you'll learn to conceal your fangs. But for now, rest. You need peace. I closed my eyes, and Benjamin exited the room. 1943, at the Fisher estate. Madam, you must be cautious. Mr. Fisher has been asking many questions, Benjamin whispered to Elizabeth as he offered her treats. Not far off, 3 girls played, chasing each other carefree and joyous. Amanda, stop teasing your sisters, Elizabeth called out to one of her daughters. I know there's no need for me to remind you. I'm watching and keeping everything under control, she said with a grimace. What concerns me more is motherhood. I'm not prepared for this at all. These children are unbearable. Can I just drink their blood now? Madam, absolutely not, the butler responded firmly, shaking his head. Otherwise, our entire plan and preparations would be wasted. To strengthen your power, they must be roughly your age when you turned. So we must wait until they're 30. That feels unbearably long. Elizabeth sighed deeply. Madam, I must also inform you, a photographer will arrive today. Mr. Fisher wishes for a family photograph. The butler returned to a formal tone. Amanda yanked Joanna by the hair and grinned mischievously, while Anna attempted to separate the sisters.
Story 3.
Alaska. Midsummer. Stephen got home in the evening, feeling weary from another encounter with the Johnson brothers. Their recklessness often unsettled him. Insane. They hunt the most dangerous monsters without considering the consequences. That's why their asses are constantly in the other ass, Stephen muttered to himself. He could fill a book with such quotes that might someday sell 1 million copies. For now, though, the hunter parked by the shore, collecting his essentials from his car. He planned to sail at night, heading downstream towards town for supplies. Climbing the gangway, Stephen quickly hoisted it aboard to prevent any unwelcome visitors. You heard right. Stephen Harris, monster hunter, lived on a boat. A cozy floating home fortified with salt, graveyard dust, seals, and amulets. It had just 2 rooms, a main cabin where Stephen took calls, managed paperwork, and occasionally sheltered fugitives or the injured, and a small bedroom. This mobile haven was his cherished escape, offering freedom to move at will. After moving across the deck to the hold, he transferred his gear from the old pickup, mostly knives, stakes, several pistols, and of course, various phones and forged identity documents, which Harris was particularly proud of, as no one had yet suspected the forgery. Checking the fridge, he found some beer reserved for special guests and a couple of sandwiches from the nearest bar, which he started to eat. Exhausted, he yearned for some rest, but was soon interrupted. "Stephen, are you there?" "Lower the gangway," called a female voice. It was Olivia, a tall, tanned woman with hair as dark as night. She had come to catch up with her friend and possibly find some work. Olivia was a hunter from the infamous Johnson family. Breaking free from her overprotective mother to hunt properly was no small feat. "You've gone quite far," she sighed heavily, realizing she couldn't get any closer and had no interest in swimming. "Stephen, I know you're home. Won't you come out?" Olivia shouted, a bit louder this time, standing on the shore. She had dodged numerous traps set by her mother, who was probably frantic by now that Olivia had left without a word. It wasn't fair. Her older brothers could vanish on hunts for months, while she was expected to play the perfect housewife. Sometimes she seriously considered leaving home for good. As the sun slowly dipped below the horizon, its last rays warmed the earth. Night was approaching, a dangerous time since, despite being a hunter, Olivia wasn't invincible. The night belonged to supernatural beings thirsty for blood and murder. Stephen had almost reached his bunk, its softness calling to him like an old friend, when a cry pierced the air, clearly meant for the huntress. He twisted his face into a humorous grimace, but nevertheless pulled himself away from his pleasant anticipation and headed up to the deck, yelling back, "There's no one here. The entrance is closed to the pesky lizard of the Johnson family." Only Stephen would respond in such a way, eliciting a melodious chuckle from Olivia. "This family haunts me too," she said, her smile brightening her tired face. Stephen lifted the gangway and carefully positioned it closer to the shore, right at the brunette's feet. Her presence was always significant, so just in case, he tucked a small flask of holy water into his pocket. Safety first, particularly when you might be unable to defend yourself effectively. "Hey, lizard," Stephen greeted with a sly smile, as was his usual manner. He loved inventing nicknames for Olivia, purely for the fun of it. As the girl climbed up the gangway onto the boat, Stephen had already switched on the spotlight, illuminating the entire deck and startling a few bats that had been resting under the roof. "Welcome aboard," he announced, pulling the gangway in after her. "Stephen, you never change. You've still got that flask in your pocket, right?" "I knew it. Don't worry, it's just me," Olivia responded, her voice betraying a hint of fatigue after almost 24 hours on the road. "I'm not a shapeshifter, and no one's stolen my identity," she added, still smiling. "Let me in and feed me. I'm starving." Stephen opened the door, welcoming Olivia inside. He was more than just a hunter. He was a hospitable host, someone who would never leave a friend in need. The life of a supernatural hunter was harsh, demanding ruthlessness and toughness. Yet Stephen managed to maintain his kindness. His optimism and boundless cheer could brighten any room. Olivia was similar. Her laughter was infectious, and Stephen adored it. "Thanks for letting me in. I love your home. It must be great to have such a boat. You can travel wherever you want. Frequent trips down the river, even fishing whenever you feel like it. All the joys of life. I envy you. The life of a free hunter," the girl said. "But being a hunter isn't all that simple. You always risk your life protecting or saving others. You work for free, conduct your own investigations, dig into various sources, gather rumors. Also, inexperienced hunters are often killed, Stephen thought to himself. He grabbed a bottle of beer from the fridge and handed it to Olivia. She popped the bottle open effortlessly and took a sip. "You're still living as usual, helping others," she observed. "Someone has to do it," Stephen replied. Just then, one of the phones rang. Stephen quickly jumped over the couch and rushed to answer it. "Agent White, North Alaska, go ahead." "What?" "James, I asked you not to use this number. Call the one where I'm Stephen, not Agent White." Stephen's face contorted as though he had just tasted something sour. "How many times do I have to tell you that you need to douse them with holy water and drive a stake through their heart? Even with their head chopped off, these monsters will continue to attack. And calling during a battle, are you out of your mind? How haven't they killed you yet?" Harris hung up the phone and sighed heavily. "My brothers again? How often do they drop by?" Stephen glanced at the calendar with a mix of curiosity and resignation. "I ran into your idiot brothers a few hours ago. They show up here every 2 weeks, more often than you." Olivia sensed that the night would be full of revelations. There was much to learn and plenty of time until dawn, though she couldn't stay long. Not that she wanted to leave, but she didn't want Harris to get in trouble with her mother later. Yet she often missed conversations with a true hunter, someone wholly dedicated to their cause. The core of a hunter's life is about supporting one another. Without that, the country would be in chaos. Demons, werewolves, vampires. There were many, and they were formidable. And there are fewer and fewer hunters as the years go by. When Olivia helped her mother at the bar, she learned much and forged valuable connections. Although most patrons tried to win her over, none had succeeded yet. Ella, her mother, made sure no one got too close to her daughter. Another burst of laughter filled the room. "You should come to the bar more often. I think you're the only man my mom wouldn't try to scare off right away," she said, her voice tinged with amusement. It was completely dark outside now, with only the moon and stars lighting the way, and the soothing sound of water lapping against the boat. It was in moments like this that Olivia remembered her first hunt, when she was severely beaten by young vampires. If it hadn't been for Stephen, she might not have survived. And her mother had cursed so loudly at the bar that no customers came for 3 days. All of Stephen's relatives had died when he was just 15 years old. Now, at 34, he couldn't even recall his father's face, who had taught him to drive, or his mother's, who had taught him to knit. Olivia felt a deep sympathy for this man who lived alone, never starting a family or having children. Stephen had devoted his entire life to hunting monsters and assisting other hunters. What's new this time? What's happening in the monster world? Will you share some information with me? Gently batting her eyelashes, Olivia smiled in her usual charming way, revealing her pearly whites and tilting her head slightly. There was no need to ask. Stephen would tell her everything anyway. Indeed, the hunter relished a good conversation. Stephen mused. "Can't seem to remember." Olivia gave him a look of mock offense. "I'll tell you, just don't give me that look. Ella's going to kill me someday. She's told me 100 times not to say anything," thought the man. But as usual, he didn't listen to his own inner voice. "Stephen, I knew you wouldn't let me down. Just make sure not to tell Mom, or she'll really give you a hard time." Stephen chuckled, recalling how Ella had scolded him last time he had divulged a little too much. She still remembers it every time she calls him to inquire about her fidgety sons. The boys rarely called Ella directly, all because of her daunting demeanor. "Well, a few of us headed north, past Utqiagvik. Werewolves went berserk there. 10 hunters are now in the Chugach forests, where demons and witches are stirring up trouble. A few more are down south, and the rest are scattered across the central region, tracking and eliminating threats. Many often come to me for advice. Stephen pulled a pillow from the cupboard and tossed it onto a small armchair. His eyes were heavy with fatigue, yet he resisted the urge to sleep. It's the usual for us. Track, confront, and sadly bear the losses which are mounting alarmingly. Stephen quickly shifted the topic, as if reluctant to dwell on the grim aspects of hunting. He remembered that he hadn't asked about Olivia's mother. Ella owned the bar where hunters gathered to unwind from their grim routines, and like Stephen, she was a pivotal figure in the hunters' network. How's Ella doing? Has she scared off all your suitors yet? You know her? She'll never change. Even her sons criticized her for being overprotective. But it was just Ella's way of showing her deep love and fear of losing Olivia, much like she had lost her husband. I'm worn out and could use some rest. You wouldn't mind if I crash here tonight, would you? Do I have a choice? Stephen replied with a wry smile, realizing with a start that dawn was not far off, and he should have been asleep hours ago to get at least a few hours of rest. Then you take the room, and I'll find a spot out here, he said. Stephen wouldn't have let the girl leave anyway. She needed a break from her relentless adventures, and Ella wouldn't mind knowing her daughter was safe for the night. So, Stephen showed Olivia to the room and decided to call the bar. Dialing the familiar number, he already anticipated their conversation. Ella? Hey, it's Stephen. What the hell are you calling so early for? Did something happen? No, nothing happened, just wanted to let you know. You don't need to worry. Olivia's with me. Tell her when she gets back. I'm putting her on a short leash. And if she came to you to dig up any dirt, keep your mouth shut, or I'll have your head. Hey, no need to yell at me. I've warned you. If she gets so much as a scratch... Ella, calm down. She's not a child anymore. I'm taking her on a simple scouting mission. You can't keep her caged forever. She might just run away. Everything will be okay. Trust me. Stephen, don't you dare hang up on me, you hear me. With a resigned sigh, Stephen ended the call. Looks like your mom practically gave you the green light to go hunting. Well, not exactly alone. Wow, you were brave. I will light a candle for you. Stephen flopped down onto the sofa chair where he had earlier thrown the pillow. With the guest taking over his usual sleeping space, he settled for the chair. Try to get some sleep. Remember, a tired hunter is a dead hunter, he said, closing his eyes. I'm sorry you have to sleep in that chair. Sweet dreams, Olivia murmured as she left. Yawning one last time, Stephen fell into a deep sleep, clutching the pillow. Olivia went into the room, collapsed on the soft bed, and fell fast asleep, not forgetting that under her pillow there was a silver knife covered with sacred symbols that her father had given her when he was still alive. Olivia managed about 5 hours of sleep. Her body had likely adapted to such brief rests. Rarely did she sleep longer. After sheathing her knife, she stretched while sitting on the bed and yawned again. Tying her hair into a high ponytail, she tiptoed out of the room, careful to make the bed. No missed calls or voicemails appeared on her phone, so her mother wouldn't be out looking for her. Seeing Stephen still asleep, she chose not to disturb him, and quietly stepped outside. The sun had already climbed high into the sky. A new day, a new narrative. She sighed, knowing her words would fade unheard. Sometimes it all felt like an endless dream. It's so peaceful here, she said aloud, lost in her thoughts. Olivia contemplated what her life might have been like if she hadn't become a hunter. Perhaps she wouldn't be risking it so frequently to save others. But hunters aren't born. They are forged. "Good morning," Stephen greeted her as he appeared. "Hope you didn't leave anything important in your car. We're about to head out," he said as he climbed into the captain's cabin, started the engine, and activated the autopilot he had proudly built himself. "We'll sail for about 40 minutes, maybe an hour, but no longer. We were expected to meet someone. That's all I can say for now," he noted, looking out over the river. The boat smoothly glided downstream, heading towards a vibrant shoreline. A little later, Stephen returned to the cabin, glanced at the maps strewn across the table, and began comparing them with the route he had previously selected. According to his calculations, the vampire was hiding exactly there. He started preparing his arsenal meticulously. He cleaned his gun, loading it with bullets that had been sanctified with prayers and drenched in holy water, then checked his pouch of dead man's ash and slipped several knives into his belt, designed to fit into a custom holster. He also stowed a few wooden stakes in his tall boots for easy access. Meanwhile, Olivia, who was still on the deck, decided to check her own equipment. She inspected her gun, which she always kept at her side, and her silver knife, etched with sacred incantations. Extra bullets were secured on her belt for quick reloading, along with small wooden stakes and a single painkiller tablet, just in case. She felt ready for anything. An hour later, the boat docked at the pier. "We've arrived," Stephen announced with a hint of excitement, stepping onto the deck and slinging a large bag filled with weaponry over his shoulder. A rugged figure was already waiting for them on the shore, a local guide who was briefed to update them on the latest developments in the small town. "I'm glad you decided to help us." "Welcome," the man greeted them warmly. "I am here to meet you." Stephen smirked and shook hands with the bearded man, who sported a distinctly rugged look. His tattered vest showcased muscular arms, and his baggy jeans with large pockets, along with his long hair and beard, added to his wild appearance. "I am Harry. But before we proceed, may I ask, is the young lady with you also a hunter? Sorry, but you, miss, seem quite young for this." "Don't let appearances deceive you. She is the devil in the flesh," said the hunter with a completely serious face. "Well, I'm sorry, Stephen. I promise to behave from now on," the girl responded with a disarmingly sweet smile. "Forgive my initial caution. Our town has become exceedingly dangerous lately, and I was reluctant to put such a charming young woman at risk. But I have no doubts about your skills." "Don't worry. We are here to help. We just need to eliminate that hellish creature, and I am confident the town will prosper again," Stephen responded graciously. The bearded man led them along the road, sharing his concerns. "I've heard a lot about hunters. Unfortunately, I lack the skills and strength that you possess, which are necessary to save my hometown. That is why I called for your assistance." "And when did this vampire first appear in your town?" Olivia inquired, her gaze surveying the layout of the town. The sparse buildings hinted at previous supernatural attacks. "About a month ago." That was all the information needed. Stephen was aware that about 3 months prior, the government, along with various secret agencies, had organized a significant operation to purge the country of vampires and werewolves. Many were captured or eliminated, and the survivors had fled to remote areas like Alaska. Because of this, the demand for hunters had increased in this region. And for the same reason, Olivia's older brothers hadn't returned home for over a month. "About a month." "You were quick to catch on?" Stephen commented, nodding towards the dense forest ahead. "How long will it take us to get there?" Olivia asked, her voice laced with a mix of anticipation and anxiety. "Not long, just a 10-minute hike into the mountains. I won't go further. I promised only to meet you, not to lead you directly to the monster's lair," the bearded man replied, shaking his head slightly before departing as swiftly as he had arrived. "Are you ready, lizard?" Stephen asked with a teasing tone. "Don't ask silly questions, and you won't get silly answers," Olivia replied with a playful smile. Stephen rolled his eyes and began leading the way towards the forest, Olivia closely following. With each step, the forest seemed to grow thicker and more ominous. Soon they stumbled upon the first grim sign, a severed female leg clad in a stocking which had fallen from a tree directly onto Stephen's head. What a mess. "Why did that idiot hang a leg?" Stephen grumbled, wiping his face in disgust. "Judging by the decomposition and smell, this leg has been here for over a month. Maybe the victim accidentally wandered into the forest," Olivia speculated, finding a dark humor in the bizarre situation, as it was not every day you saw such a shocking expression on your companion's face. Stephen knelt down to examine the leg more closely. It was brutally torn off and bore signs of being gnawed on. Clearly, the vampire was also a cannibal. Blood alone wasn't satisfying its grotesque appetite. "Disgusting creature," Stephen muttered, voicing his thoughts. "Poor girl, left without a limb. Her screams must have echoed through the forest that night. But it doesn't matter now. People are naturally fragile and curious. She surely brought this upon herself, venturing into the woods at night, perhaps lured by some strange sound," Olivia mused. "Stephen, don't you think that Harry didn't tell us everything? He seems too nice at first glance, and besides, this monster has been here much longer. It's just a hunch," Olivia added thoughtfully. "They always hide something. First rule of the hunt, never fully trust anyone." "All right, let's keep moving. We'll find out what's really happening here," Stephen responded firmly. Having found the first gruesome remains, they expected more ahead. Stephen took out his gun and disengaged the safety, ready for what was to come. After a few hundred meters, they discovered an abandoned house. It needed to be checked, though if the vampire was hiding inside, it would have sensed their presence by now. Olivia gave Stephen a quick nod and pointed towards the house, indicating she would enter first. He needed to cover her if necessary. With her gun at the ready, Olivia stealthily made her way into the house. Stephen didn't have time to warn her of the potential dangers or stop her. The determined brunette had already slipped through the door. Sighing resignedly, Stephen followed, drawing his own weapon as he entered the shadowy interior. Opening the door, Olivia stepped inside, her eyes scanning the surroundings. Bones and pieces of flesh were strewn everywhere, and the walls were smeared with blood, clear evidence of the gruesome struggles that had taken place. She was correct in her assumption. This house was indeed the lair she sought. For a moment she was distracted by the horrific decor, and when she turned around she found herself face to face with the monster. Panic surged within her, but it didn't paralyze her resolve. Noticing the weapon in her hands, the vampire swiftly pushed her against the wall, its piercing gaze locking with hers. The pistol slipped from her grasp, now lying just out of reach. The creature, using telekinesis, flung her aside again, this time with less gentleness. Olivia's head struck the wall hard. Stephen entered the house just in time to see Olivia collapsing unconscious. He momentarily lost his composure, rushing to her side, oblivious to the lurking danger. At that moment, the vampire attacked him. It tried to manipulate him with telekinesis, but Stephen was protected by a protective amulet. Thwarted, the creature resorted to using its claws. With a swift strike, The vampire sent Stephen flying across the room, where he crashed into a table, breaking it under his weight. When the vampire lunged again, Stephen, despite his disorientation, managed to fire his gun, hitting the monster in the abdomen. With a furious roar, the vampire fled, grabbing a bag of weapons that lay nearby as it escaped. Overwhelmed, Stephen lost consciousness. The hunt had turned grim. The hunters lay unconscious in an abandoned house, while the monster, wounded but still dangerous, likely lurked nearby. Vampire regeneration was not instantaneous. It would need time. Stephen woke up an hour later. It was already dark outside, so it was pitch black inside the house. He fumbled for the flashlight in his pocket and, upon turning it on, immediately directed the beam towards Olivia, who lay still. "Olivia?" Stephen's voice was hoarse as he slowly approached her. He hovered his hand over her lips to check her breathing, relieved to feel the faint stir of air. Her breathing was shallow, but steady. She was alive. Everything would be okay, he reassured himself. His head throbbed painfully, and each breath was a struggle. Touching the back of his head would confirm it. His hand would come away with blood. He gently tapped Olivia's cheek, then more firmly. "Olivia!" he called louder, urging her to respond. He knew they didn't have much time. The monster could return at any moment. A gentle slap brought Olivia slowly back to consciousness. A pained groan escaped her lips. The monster's blows had been severe. Her head felt like it was splitting open. Her vision blurred with pain. She squinted, trying to focus, and gingerly touched her temple, wincing at the sharp pain. She couldn't believe she might die because of a young vampire, no smarter than a wild beast. Being bested by such a pathetic creature was an insult to hunters everywhere. "Stephen, are you okay? Did you kill it?" she managed to ask. Seeing him disheveled and injured too, her surprise turned into concern. "What? He got you too? Damn, are you serious?" "No time to judge. I was trying to save you," Stephen replied, his voice tinged with frustration, but also relief that Olivia was awake. They needed to regroup and prepare. The vampire would undoubtedly come back to finish what it had started. Slowly leaning against the wall for support, Olivia rose to her feet. The impact from being thrown against the wall had left a sharp pain in her back, which was now asserting itself with every movement. Despite the discomfort, she scanned the room, her eyes finally landing on her pistol, which had skidded to a stop behind an old, half-broken wooden chair. The sight fueled her anger. "We need to finish this, no matter what. If my brothers and Mom, if they find out, I don't even want to think about it." "How about you, Stephen? You seem even worse off than me. I have a pill. Take it. It'll help with the headache." "Keep it for yourself. I'll manage," the hunter replied gruffly, sitting down and then standing up, testing his coordination. Olivia swallowed the painkiller and retrieved her pistol. "How far do you think this monster could have gotten?" "I'd suggest my brilliant idea, but you wouldn't agree to me being bad." "It's probably still close by," Stephen speculated. If Stephen had entertained the idea of using her as bait, they could set a trap for the vampire, but it was a tremendous risk. Olivia knew the monster feared fire, so they needed a plan that involved luring it and setting the place ablaze. "Burning down the house while I'm inside sounds like suicide. It seems I have a serious head injury since I'm suggesting such nonsense." "Don't even think about it," Stephen said sharply, a tone that brooked no argument. "No arson, especially not with you inside." After a moment of silence, Stephen pulled out his pistol and knife. "Let's start with this." He took a bag of graveyard dirt from his pocket and quickly sprinkled it over all the doors and windows except one. It was doubtful this would stop the vampire, but it might slow it down. "We'll figure something out, but you're not staying in this house." "I'll stay. I'll wait for the creature. You need to find a safe place. First, seal the window with dirt, then set it on fire." "Why should you stay in the house instead of me?" Olivia's tone was tinged with dissatisfaction, but there was no time to argue. The vampire could return at any moment. She found herself holding graveyard dirt in her hands, and suddenly an idea clicked in her mind. Maybe everything would turn out like in a thrilling movie where the hero jumps out of the window at the last second. Stephen tossed his favorite lighter to her. He flashed a smile, then stood up and headed to the pantry through the kitchen, likely looking for gasoline, kerosene, or alcohol as a last resort. Returning, he carried a canister of gasoline and bottles of whiskey. He tossed the bottles to Olivia. "Maybe we'll come up with another plan," Olivia asked, hesitating as she held the bottles, her mind racing for alternatives. "Olivia, listen to me very carefully," Stephen said, his tone unusually grave. "This is no ordinary vampire. I was wrong. It's of ancient lineage and possesses telekinetic powers. My amulet protected me from its initial attack, but I'm not sure how much longer it will hold. Here, take the amulet. It's more crucial for you now, and if I don't make it out, you must leave immediately. Dante, wait for me. Do you understand?" For the first time in her life, Olivia felt a genuine fear while standing next to Stephen. He always appeared so robust and unyielding, like an indestructible fortress. "Don't talk like that. It's just a vampire. No matter its ancient blood, we'll handle it together." "I'm not leaving you behind," she responded, her voice choked with emotion. A lump formed in her throat, and despite the dull ache that still clouded her head, her vision had cleared. "Go." "Dante, wait around. When it breaks in, I'll confront it." Stephen started to pour gasoline in the kitchen, creating a hazardous environment. A single spark could set everything ablaze. Heeding his instruction, she began dousing the living room, then stepped outside to continue the task, ensuring to leave the designated window free from flames to provide him an escape route. After completing her rounds, she re-entered the building. "Be careful, or I'll never forgive myself," he said solemnly. Throughout these moments, Olivia's eyes were fixed on Stephen, and in a sudden burst of emotion she hugged him tightly, as if she might never have another chance. She then forced a smile and averted her gaze. The thought that he might not survive haunted her. Holding an extra bottle, she tore off a piece of her shirt, fashioning a makeshift Molotov cocktail, and handed it to him. A contingency plan just in case. "Good luck. I want to be far," she reassured him. "I hope to see you again soon," Stephen whispered back, watching her retreating figure with a mix of hope and dread. Olivia quickly left the house and concealed herself nearby. Time seemed to slow as the vampire approached the house, cautiously scanning its surroundings, then vanished inside. Seizing the moment, Olivia dashed to the doorway, sprinkling graveyard dirt across it and not neglecting the window. Inhale, exhale. She lit the bottle and hurled it into the house. Her heart pounded violently against her chest. Her hands trembled visibly from the intense nerves. Clutching the final bottle and lighter, she prepared for his escape, ready to throw it at the crucial moment. A wild scream pierced the air, causing her heart to skip a beat in terror. She was genuinely scared. When this ordeal was over, they would certainly have a reason to celebrate. For now, all she could do was wait. Meanwhile, Stephen braced himself inside, trusting that the amulet would keep Olivia concealed from the vampire's senses. He was not overly concerned for her safety, but prepared himself for the imminent showdown. "Where are you, monster? I can't wait all night," Stephen muttered impatiently under his breath. As expected, the monster burst into the house shortly after. But this time, Stephen was prepared for the encounter, agilely dodging its sharp claws. He maneuvered around the vampire, and at that precise moment, a Molotov cocktail flew into the room. The vampire tried to dash for the door, but found it unyielding, sealed by the graveyard dirt. A wild roar filled the space, shaking the walls, forcing Stephen to cover his ears with his hands. Despite the chaos, a satisfied smile played on his lips. His trap had successfully sprung. "Stephen, don't kill me! I haven't done anything wrong!" the vampire suddenly pleaded, its form shifting before Stephen's eyes, morphing into Harry, the bearded man they had met at the pier. "So, you've been masquerading as a young vampire all this time, huh? Ancient and fearless of the sun. For the first time in my life, luck is on my side. I know who you are. You're Dracula's younger brother," Stephen deduced aloud. "Please, I'll do anything you ask. Just let me go." "Remove the graveyard dirt. Allow me to leave," the vampire bargained desperately. "How many have you killed over your long life?" "I'm well informed, you know. Nearly 30 people have disappeared in this town just this past month, all you're doing. We're going to burn here together. Give my regards to your brother in hell," Stephen declared, his eyes wild with a mixture of fury and triumph. The fire spread quickly, the structure of the roof threatening to give way at any moment, and yet Stephen was nowhere to be seen escaping. Olivia, stationed by the window through which he was supposed to emerge, prayed silently. The heat inside was intense. Flames danced around, reducing everything to ash. This dilapidated shack would burn to the ground, taking the malevolent force responsible for countless deaths with it. Stephen had promised her he would make it out, and there he was, dashing from the back of the house and leaping through the window. Olivia, who had been nervously tapping her fingers and muttering to herself, rushed forward to help. "Idiot, what took you so long?" She managed between sobs and tears, her relief palpable as she saw him safe. For the first time, Stephen saw her in such a vulnerable state. "Lizard, don't cry, I'm okay," he reassured her gently. "Idiot," she muttered again, and impulsively kissed him. The hunters sat watching the remnants of the shack consumed by flames. Stephen was elated. He now had an epic tale to recount to other hunters at the bar. Yet a looming concern cast a shadow over his joy. The impending conversation with Olivia's mother, Ella. Known to be more formidable than any demon or vampire, the thought of facing her was more daunting than any supernatural threat. Yet for the first time, Stephen felt resolved not to back down. He wanted to start a real family, with a wife and children, despite the challenges that might bring. Story 4. I remember that summer with a clarity that often evades other memories of my early 20s. It was a time when the days stretched long and lazy before us. My friends and I lived in a rhythm dictated by academic calendars and the pulsing beat of city life. On one particularly sweltering day, as the city baked under a relentless sun, we found refuge in a quaint cafe tucked away in a quieter part of town. The cafe, with its mismatched furniture and walls adorned with local art, a place where we'd while away hours over iced coffees and aimless chatter. It was there we met Nikki. She breezed into the cafe like a gust of cool wind, her laughter ringing clear and her eyes sparkling with an irrepressible vivacity. Nikki was one of those rare people who radiated warmth and charisma, drawing others to her almost effortlessly. She joined our table, invited by a mutual friend, and within minutes, it was as if she'd always been part of the group. In the weeks that followed, Nikki became an integral part of our circle. Her wit was as sharp as her infectious humor, and she had a knack for storytelling that could leave us hanging on her every word. We would gather around our usual table, the aroma of coffee in the air, and Nikki would tell us stories about her childhood in a small town far from the bustling city. As summer vacation loomed, Nikki invited us to spend a week at her family's place in her hometown. The idea was met with lukewarm enthusiasm at first. None of us were particularly keen on leaving the comfort of the city for a sleepy, unknown town. Sensing our hesitation, Nikki's eyes took on a mischievous glint. "Let me sweeten the deal," she said, leaning in to share a secret. "There's a legend in my town. They say there's a real vampire living in the neighborhood who preys on both animals and humans." We laughed, of course. The idea was ludicrous, something out of a Gothic novel, not real life. But there was something in the way Nikki told the story, her voice dropping to a hush, her eyes alight with a mix of fear and excitement, that made us pause. Curiosity, that most human of traits, began to take root. So, we agreed. We decided to journey to this small, unknown town, if only to break the monotony of our city lives. A few days into our stay in Nikki's hometown, the novelty of being away from the city began to wear off, replaced by a sense of peaceful monotony. The town, with its narrow, winding streets and quaint houses, seemed to exist in a bubble, untouched by the rush of the outside world. Our days were spent exploring the local sites, with Nikki as our enthusiastic guide, sharing stories and legends of her town. The idea to camp in the forest came up spontaneously one evening, as we sat around Nikki's kitchen table, the remnants of a hearty meal laid out before us. The forest, a vast expanse of dense trees and winding trails, bordered the town. Equipped with backpacks laden with provisions, our sleeping bags rolled tightly, and a large tent that promised to be a challenge to set up, we set out towards the forest. The sunlight filtered through the dense canopy, casting dappled shadows on the forest floor. We found a clearing near a wild lake, the water a clear, deep blue that promised a refreshing escape from the summer heat. Setting up the tent proved to be an adventure in itself. Nikki took charge, directing us with a mix of amusement and exasperation as we fumbled with the poles and canvas. Eventually the tent stood, albeit a little lopsided, a testament to our collective effort. The lake was a welcome respite, its waters cool and invigorating. We swam and splashed around, the cares of the world seemingly a million miles away. The picnic that followed was simple: sandwiches, fruit, and cold drinks. But in that moment, it felt like a feast. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, a hush fell over our group. The playful atmosphere of the day gave way to a sense of anticipation, a feeling that something was about to happen. We gathered around a makeshift fire, the flames casting a warm glow on our faces. Nikki, with a flair for drama, began to tell the story of the vampire, her voice a low, captivating murmur that seemed to blend with the crackling of the fire. "Simon," she said, "was a boy shadowed by misfortune from his first breath. His mother, a vibrant soul loved by all, passed away giving birth to him. In this town, where superstitions run as deep as the roots of the old forest, people whispered of a curse." She paused, and in that silence, the forest seemed to lean in, as if eager to hear more about Simon. His childhood, Nikki continued, was marked by illness and solitude. He was in the hospital a lot, couldn't get better. He was raised by his father, a man broken by grief yet devoted to his son. But tragedy struck again. His father was found dead under the most bizarre circumstances. Nikki's voice dropped to a whisper, compelling us to lean closer. The body it was as if every drop of life had been drained from him. A shiver ran through me, and I wasn't alone. Around the fire, I saw my friends pull their jackets tighter, glancing uneasily into the shadows cast by the flickering flames. Nikki's eyes, reflecting the fire's dance, held a somber depth. The police were baffled. No signs of struggle, no clues to what happened. It was as if the life had been sucked out of him, leaving behind a husk. She looked around our circle, her gaze lingering on each of us. After the bewildering discovery of his father's lifeless body, an event that shook our small town to its core, young Simon was taken in by his grandmother. I still remember the first time I saw her. She was an enigmatic figure, her back straight as an arrow, her eyes sharp and piercing. Despite her advanced age, she moved with an energy that belied the wrinkles etching her face. The townsfolk had always been wary of her. I recall hearing hushed conversations at the local diner, where people speculated about her age and origins. Some joked that she had been around when the town was founded, a comment that seemed less like hyperbole with each passing year. Her resilience and vigor were subjects of much speculation and unease. Simon, once a frail and sickly child, began to change under her care. It was gradual at first, a newfound color in his cheeks, a brightness in his eyes. But soon, the transformation became undeniable. He grew stronger, healthier. The change in Simon was the talk of the town. Neighbors theorizing about the sudden shift. The most persistent rumor was unsettling. They said his grandmother, whom some whispered to be a witch, was adding human and animal blood to Simon's milk. It was a ridiculous idea, other residents thought so. But pets did start going missing in the town. The rumors about his grandmother intensified. Some said she was seen wandering the woods at night. Others claimed to have found strange symbols etched into the trees near her home. The tales were many, each more fantastical than the last, but the undercurrent of fear was real. The days in our town seemed to stretch longer after Simon's transformation under his grandmother's care. His behavior became increasingly peculiar, only adding to the swirling rumors. He rarely ventured out during the day, and the townsfolk noticed a peculiar pattern. Simon could only be seen wandering the streets after sunset, his figure a fleeting shadow in the twilight. The rumors about him running around town at night like an animal weren't unfounded. Old Mr. Jenkins, who lived 2 houses down, swore he saw Simon one night. He said Simon's eyes glowed in the dark, a pair of luminescent orbs that seemed to pierce through the night's veil. Simon's grandmother, the enigmatic figure at the center of so many tales, passed away suddenly. Her death sent shockwaves through the town. Many had thought her to be almost immortal, a constant in our ever-changing world. Her demise was as mysterious as her life, leaving behind more questions than answers. But it was Simon's disappearance that truly unsettled the town. He wasn't found at his grandmother's house or anywhere in the neighborhood. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. Days turned into weeks, and still there was no trace of Simon. The once omnipresent rumors began to wane, replaced by a silence that was almost as disconcerting. People started to move on, the mystery of Simon and his grandmother slowly receding into the background of our daily lives. The night was deepening around our campfire, and Nikki's voice seemed to be the only thing anchoring us to reality as she continued the story of the strange occurrences that followed Simon's grandmother's death. The flames flickered, casting ghostly shadows on our faces as we listened, rapt and unsettled. "A few months after the old woman passed away," Nikki said, her voice taking on a somber tone. The town was shaken by a series of gruesome discoveries. She described how it started with livestock. Cows from the local farms found lifeless, their bodies drained and withered in a way that was eerily reminiscent of Simon's father's death. The air around us felt colder as she spoke of the growing unease in the town. Pets began to disappear. Cats, dogs, even birds from their cages, only to be found in the same desiccated state. The townsfolk, already on edge from the rumors surrounding Simon and his grandmother, started to whisper of a curse, a malevolent force lurking in the shadows. The horror escalated when the first human victim was found. It was a hiker, Nikki recounted. Well known in town. He had gone into the woods and never came back. The body, when found, bore the same disturbing signs, as if every ounce of life had been sucked out of it. A palpable fear had gripped the town, Nikki explained. People were afraid to venture out after dusk. The police, once dismissive of the townspeople's superstitions, were now compelled to act. They organized search parties, patrolled the streets at night, and warned everyone to stay vigilant, Nikki said. The hunt for what was now being called the monster killer was underway, an ominous phrase that seemed to hang in the air like a dark cloud. That's when it all started to unravel, the threads of speculation and rumor weaving into a tapestry of fear and accusation. Nikki's voice, steady and solemn, filled the air as she continued her tale by the dying embers of our campfire. At first it was just whispers, Nikki said, her eyes reflecting the fire's glow. But then, more and more people began to believe that Simon was behind it all. She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. They said that when his mother was cursed, Simon had been reborn as something else in her womb. A monster, a vampire, Nikki continued, almost hesitantly, as if saying the word aloud gave it power. Fed by his mother's blood, he became a full-fledged creature of the night. The story took a darker turn as Nikki described Simon's alleged escape. He knew he was being hunted, that he couldn't stay in the forest or the town. Her voice was a whisper now, barely audible over the crackling of the fire. So he left. But not forever, sometimes, Nikki said, her gaze distant. He comes back. And that's when the eerie events begin. She spoke of nights when the people living near the forest would hear the sound of a child sobbing. At first, they would rush out to help, but the crying would stop abruptly, as if it were never there. Days after the mysterious crying, murders would occur in the town. They would last about a week, and then, as suddenly as they began, they would stop. It's as if Simon gets bored or satiated, and then he disappears, leaving the town in an uneasy quiet. I looked around at my friends, their faces half lit by the fire, eyes wide with a mixture of fear and fascination. As Nikki's story drew to a close, the fire had dwindled to a mere smolder, casting long, flickering shadows across our small circle. Years later, of course, it all became legendary, she said, her voice now a mere murmur against the backdrop of the nocturnal forest. But even now, when townspeople hear a baby crying in the woods, they don't think it's just an animal or the wind. They think it's him, Simon. They tie up their cattle near the forest, she said, as a sort of sacrificial offering, hoping Simon will feed on them and leave the townspeople unharmed. The idea was chilling, a ritual born of fear and superstition, a testament to the power of the legend that had grown around Simon. Nikki looked around at our faces, lit intermittently by the dying fire. He's expected to come in the next few days, she added, a seriousness in her tone that I hadn't heard before. We should be careful. We could try to see him, but we should do it just before dawn, for our own safety. As we prepared for bed, the story hung heavily in the air around us. I could tell by the quiet, contemplative expressions of my friends that they too were processing the tale, each lost in their thoughts. Lying in my tent, I listened to the sounds of the night. The rustle of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, the soft murmur of my friend's breathing. The story of Simon, this boy turned into a creature of the night, seemed to merge with the darkness around us, creating an atmosphere thick with anticipation and dread. That night was restless for me, fraught with unsettling dreams that clung to the edges of my consciousness even as I awoke. In my dreams, I wandered through a landscape of blood and dried corpses, a nightmarish vista that seemed to stretch on endlessly. I woke up with a start, my shirt clinging to me, damp with sweat. The tent felt stifling, almost suffocating. I needed air to escape the remnants of the dream that seemed to linger in the close confines of the tent. Slipping out quietly, so as not to disturb the others, I found myself in the cool embrace of the night. The sky above was a tapestry of stars, a stark contrast to the darkness of my dream. In the city, such a view was rare, the lights often drowning out the celestial display. Here it was a breathtaking sight. As I sat near our dwindling campfire, my eyes tracing the constellations above, a sound broke the stillness of the night, a quiet, plaintive crying. It was so faint I thought I might have imagined it. But then it came again, unmistakable this time. A baby crying. Curiosity mingled with a sense of adventure spurred me to my feet. Everyone else was asleep, their breathing steady and even in the quiet of the night. The story Nikki had shared flickered in my mind, but I pushed aside the unease it brought. Grabbing my smartphone, I thought I might capture something, anything, that could explain the crying. I didn't venture far from our camp. The forest was a different world at night, shadows dancing between the trees, the sounds of nocturnal creatures a soft backdrop. And then I saw him, a boy, about 10 years old, standing near a tree. He was rubbing his eyes with his hands, crying. The supernatural haze I half expected to see was absent. He looked like any ordinary child, lost and frightened. He was dressed only in a tank top and shorts, barefoot, his small frame shivering in the cool night air. My instincts as an older brother kicked in. I rushed over to the child, concern overriding any lingering fear from Nikki's story. I draped my jacket over his small shoulders, trying to offer some comfort. "Hey, it's okay, you're safe now," I said, my voice soft and reassuring. The child looked up at me, his hands falling away from his face. That's when I saw it. His tears weren't the usual clear drops, but a startling, vivid red. Blood. He was crying bloody tears. A cold shiver ran down my spine, my heart pounding in my chest. Every horror story, every urban legend I'd ever heard, paled in comparison to the sight before me. The realization hit me like a bolt of lightning. The boy with the bloody tears, standing so close, had to be Simon, the vampire from Nikki's stories. Fear gripped me, icy and sharp. My voice, shrill with terror, shattered the stillness of the dawn. "Help, vampire!" The next second was a blur. Simon, or the boy I believed to be Simon, bolted away with a speed that defied reality. It was as if one moment he was there, and the next he was just a vanishing shadow among the trees. My friends, roused from their sleep by my screams, emerged from their tents, sleepy and disgruntled. The early morning air was chilly, and they wrapped themselves in blankets, irritation evident in their half-awake faces. "What's going on?" Mike asked, rubbing his eyes, trying to make sense of the situation. I was panting, my heart racing as I tried to explain. "I saw him. Simon, the vampire. He was crying blood," I said, my words tumbling out in a rush. Their reactions were a mix of disbelief and annoyance. Sarah, always the practical one, frowned. "Are you sure you weren't dreaming? It's been a long night with all those stories." But I was adamant. "I'm telling you, it was him. He ran off into the woods." As the sun rose higher, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, my friends' skepticism grew. They suggested it was a nightmare, a trick of the light, or perhaps a lost child. But nothing could shake my conviction that what I had seen was real. From that day on, things changed. My friends started to make fun of me, playfully at first, but then with a hint of mockery. "There goes the vampire hunter," they'd jest. Or, "Seen any blood-sucking creatures lately?" Despite their teasing, a part of me couldn't let go of what I'd seen. Every rustle in the bushes, every unexpected sound in the night brought me back to that encounter. I spent my days replaying the moment over and over in my mind, questioning, analyzing, trying to make sense of it. I couldn't shake off the conviction that what I had experienced was real. The image of the boy with bloody tears was etched into my memory, a haunting reminder of a truth that everyone else refused to see.